Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming, chapters 451 through 460 of the previous episode. At the foot of the lone peak in Stalactite Mountain, a momentous clash unfolds. Jian Lai, having honed his martial arts through a million punches and tempered his soul via the Sword Qi Great Wall, finally confronts the formidable Ding Ying. Despite Ding Ying's overwhelming mastery and the chaotic interference of his own past failures, Jian Lai stands his ground. Drawing upon the profound sword intent he witnessed from Mr. Qi, Jian executes a strike that mirrors the scholarly sage's own power, shattering the formation and forcing the arrogant Ding Ying onto the defensive. In this intense display of martial Dao, Jian transcends his previous limitations. With his foundation solidified and his spirit unbroken, Jian proves that even a simple martial artist can stand as an equal to the world's most powerful immortals, setting the stage for his eventual journey to the Sword Qi Great Wall. If you're able to, please support me on PayPal to help me stay active. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. When Jian Lai regained consciousness, the moon was already hanging high in the sky. Perhaps it was due to the saber and sword by his hips, but the owner of the wine shop hadn't dared to shoo him away. Instead, he had pinched his nose and allowed this traveler to occupy the table without buying anything else. In the end, Jian Lai had given the owner some extra silver coins, with the sudden wealth falling from the skies causing the owner to become very happy. Jian Lai slowly strolled back to Champion Scholar Alley. The brothels had little business, and the beautiful women who worked there were mostly leaning over the railings in a lazy manner. Jian Lai glanced up, and he discovered that these women were wearing much lighter makeup than usual. However, they somehow appeared more attractive compared to when they put on layers upon layers of heavy makeup. As he walked along the alley, many women tried to strike up a conversation or playfully tease him. In fact, a woman even directly threw her embroidered handkerchief at him and shouted, "Handsome little brother, why don't you come up and take a seat? I'll treat you to some tea, and you can sit directly on Big Sister's legs." The women in her brothel and the surrounding brothels instantly started to make noise and shout at each other, not holding back as they swore and threw around lewd words. Jian Lai easily dodged the embroidered handkerchief. However, he glanced back at the embroidered handkerchief on the ground before picking it up and rolling it into a ball, tossing it back to that woman in the brothel. The women in the brothels fell silent for a moment before immediately breaking into loud laughter. Jian Lai's mind was as calm as still water as he returned to the alley with no name. When he reached the alley corner, a man and a woman dressed in commoner clothes were standing there and waiting for him. They were quite young and appeared to be less than 30 years old. However, their breathing was calm and their aura was stable. In the context of the lotus flower-blessed land, they could be regarded as young elites who possessed good talent and a solid foundation. Of course, there was still a huge gulf between them and prodigies such as Smiley Face, Zhou Shi, and the others. The two of them revealed their names and told Jian Lai that they were spies in the capital, under the direct command of Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu. The man handed 2 packages to Jian Lai, one of which held the stolen books that they had found in a bookshop in a neighboring district. The other package contained some books related to building bridges that they had chosen from the Ministry of Works. Afterward, the woman handed Jian Lai a secret official document that contained information on the impoverished scholar with the surname Jiang, as well as the Peepa woman. Jian Lai smiled and thanked them before returning to Chao Qinglong's house. He had killed Pink Vajrama Xian and the Peepa woman on the street, and had almost killed Bird's Eye View Peak's Lu Feng soon afterward. He had then defeated Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu, and had finally killed the Demon Force's paramount leader Ding Ying. Just like that time on the city wall when old General Lu Xiao had personally witnessed Taoist Nun Huangting's paramount battle against Yu Zheni, these spies of Southern Garden Nation who traveled on the boundary between the Imperial Court and the Cultivation world would also feel the urge to remark, "That's the power of true immortals," when they learned of these incredible battles and feats. Right now, Jian Lai's fame and power in this world were even greater than what Ding Ying had experienced during his peak. When Jian Lai slowly pushed the courtyard door open and disappeared into the house, the young woman finally exhaled before taking a deep breath. As it turned out, she had held her breath and not dared to breathe the entire time. Her voice was extremely soft as she said, "So he truly is that young?" The young man remained silent, feeling slightly helpless. "He's truly so handsome." the young woman added with a smile. However, even she felt a little embarrassed after saying this. Right at this moment, that person suddenly walked backward out of the house, leaned back and raised his thumb at the young woman, saying with a faint smile, "You have very good taste." The young woman was completely stupefied, and even the unsmiling young man was slightly caught off guard. When the courtyard door finally swung shut with a soft thud, the young woman furiously covered her face with her hands and forcefully stomped the ground. The young man couldn't help but sigh. In reality, it was extremely out of character for the young woman to act. She had worked as a spy for 7 years, and was extremely skilled at hiding herself. She was always meticulous and reliable, and she had completed many important tasks for the imperial court of Southern Garden Nation. Even Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu was very impressed by her, and his trust in her was reflected in the fact that he had assigned her and the young man to keep an eye on Northern Jin Nation's Dragon General Tang Tie this time. Inside the courtyard, Chao Qinglang and the skinny little girl whose name was yet unknown were both sitting on small stools. They were the same age as each other, yet they weren't talking to each other at this moment. The skinny little girl was snacking on roasted sunflower seeds which she had most likely obtained from Chao Qinglang. The ground was filled with shells that she had casually tossed aside, and she immediately became a little panicked when she saw Chan Ping'an. Chan Ping'an glanced at the shells on the ground, after which the skinny little girl immediately shoved the remaining sunflower seeds into her pockets and started to clean up the mess. Chan Ping'an greeted Chao Qinglang before returning to his room and lighting the oil lamp. He opened the 2 packages, and saw that the stack of books that the skinny little girl had stolen and sold was still in pristine condition. He returned them to their original position on the desk. He then placed the books from the Ministry of Works on the other side of the table. There were 2 stacks of books on the table now, and they were like 2 small mountains or 2 mighty door gods. After putting the books aside, Chan Ping'an opened the secret official document and scanned through the detailed records of the impoverished scholar with the surname Jiang as well as the Peepa woman. He then placed the secret official document back inside the envelope before slipping it inside one of the many books. Chan Ping'an started to review this mysterious and inexplicable game of Go. Even though his journey through the lotus flower-blessed land had been filled with deadly dangers, he had ultimately ended up reaping many huge rewards. Not only had he broken through the barrier of the 4th tier and reached the 5th tier during his first battle against superior Grandmaster Zhongqiu, but Zhongqiu had even put his status aside and chosen to voluntarily spar with him the second time around. This had allowed Chan Ping'an to stabilize his 5th tier cultivation base. Even though Zhongqiu also had his own considerations at the time, for example, he had speculated that Ding Ying and Eugenie had most likely formed an alliance, one which he was unwilling to see succeed. This didn't take away from his magnanimity as a grandmaster, his strength as a martial artist, or his nature as a person. These were all qualities that Chan Ping'an sincerely admired. Afterward, Chan Ping'an had experienced a hearty battle full of twists and turns with Ding Ying. Chan Ping'an had properly wielded a sword against an enemy for the first time in his life, and sure enough, he had realized that pure martial artists indeed needed to temper their physiques through critical moments of life and death. Chan Ping'an wasn't sure about the 5th tier cultivation base of other people in Majestic World, but he was confident that he had tempered his own to quite a decent level. This was the foundation of his strength and everything else, so Chan Ping'an naturally wouldn't give it away no matter how much money he was offered. This was saying something, seeing how big of a miser he was. Taking 10,000 steps back, he wouldn't have wasted his time traveling through the lotus flower-blessed land even if he ultimately failed to rebuild his bridge of immortality. Compared to his initial plan of traveling to ancient battlefield ruins or martial sage temples to try his luck in advancing to the 5th tier, his achievements in the lotus flower-blessed land were already amazing and far beyond his expectations. However, there were obviously hidden dangers lurking in the shadows of his immense success. The problem lay in the fact that Ding Ying's Yin soul had been pummeled from the peak of Bull Mountain to that huge crater in the ground, especially the pool of lightning inside it. In the end, the abundant spiritual energy and the shattered martial fortune that had been attracted to the region around Bull Mountain had all funneled into Chan Ping'an's body and seeped into his soul. Even now, Chan Ping'an could still vaguely detect the lingering haze over his mind's lake. There was also rumbling thunder and flashing lightning, as if there were flood dragons soaring through the mists and flashes of sword lights slashing through the haze. Indeed, it appeared as if numerous swords were slashing down at the many fled dragons. Thankfully, this abundant spiritual energy that conflicted with the true chi of pure martial artists was located in a relatively remote area of his body. As a result, the two bursts of power were yet to clash with each other. One had to remember that chi refiners and pure martial artists in Majestic World chose two very different paths right from the very beginning. Martial artists needed to disperse all of their spiritual energy and cultivate a burst of pure true chi that was like a fire dragon patrolling their acupoints. Meanwhile, the more spiritual energy of heaven and earth that chi refiners could absorb, the better. Afterward, chi refiners would simply eliminate the bad and keep the good, opening up new territories and transforming their acupoints into cities and mini-worlds that were like gigantic lakes located next to rivers. Regardless of whether they experience floods or droughts, chi refiners would remain capable of interacting with these small worlds inside their bodies, and thus obtain a continuous supply of spiritual energy. Afterward, they could construct a core abode and refine a golden core. They could then nurture their yin soul and yang soul, after which they could finally become an earth immortal. The situation inside Chen Pingan's body was that of his pure true chi facing off against the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. They were like two opposing armies standing in formation, and just barely avoiding an all-out conflict. Chen Pingan pushed these thoughts out of his mind and grabbed his sword-nurturing gourd from the table, drinking a mouthful of wine. Was it actually this difficult to rebuild one's bridge of immortality? It was truly the case that destroying things was easy while rebuilding things was difficult. Not only that, but he had almost died in this lotus flower-blessed land as well. Chen Pingan couldn't help but feel a sense of lingering fear upon thinking of this possibility. Even if 60 years in the lotus flower-blessed land were shorter than 60 years in Majestic World, it was still certain that he would fail to uphold his promise of 10 years with Ning Yao. Moreover, just how old would Li Baoping and Li Huai be in 10 years? Would they be bullied by others during this time? And what about Bamboo Scroll Lake's Gu Kan? Would Lu Xianying have returned home in splendor yet failed to find him in the small town? What would happen to Dragon Spring Prefecture's downtrodden mountain? What would happen to the bamboo building and his home in Clay Vase Alley? What would happen to his two shops in Dragon Riding Alley? Chen Pingan stood up, and it wasn't long before he heard someone knocking on the courtyard door. The skinny little girl immediately ran over to Chen Pingan's wing room as if seeking praise, and she was just about to inform him of a guest's arrival. However, Chen Pingan had already walked out and opened the courtyard door. The visitor was the young female spy from Southern Garden Nation, and she was carrying a long case as she stood there. These are the belongings left behind by the Peepa woman. The Imperial Preceptor just instructed someone to bring them over, and they asked me to deliver them to esteemed Immortal Chen, she explained in a soft voice. Before Chen Pingan could say anything, she had already flushed a slight shade of red and turned around to run away in panic. Chao Qinglang simply felt a sense of curiosity when he saw this. However, the skinny little girl's eyes immediately started to dart around in thought. Chen Pingan placed the broken Peepa in his room. Chao Qinglang returned to his room to read under the glow of the oil lamp, while the skinny little girl continued to sit on the small stool and snack on the roasted sunflower seeds. However, she was smarter about her actions this time, and she didn't toss the shells onto the ground as if she were a divine maiden scattering flowers into the world. Instead, she placed the shells in a neat pile beside her feet. Chen Pingan walked toward the small stools and discovered that Chao Qinglang had left his straw fan on his stool. He gently picked it up before sitting down and saying to the skinny little girl, "You can go home now." She blinked as she ate the sunflower seeds, and she shook her head and replied, "Home? What home? I don't have a home. I'm nothing more than a little beggar, so how can I have a home? There are heaps of bad people among the beggars, and they always like to beat me. I'm too young and I often can't eat enough to fill my stomach. I'm also very weak, so I naturally can't beat any of them in a fight. The good locations in the capital have all been occupied by them, and I obviously don't have the ability to take any of these locations off them. As a result, I can only look for random places like areas under bridges, or on top of the stone lions of wealthy families." "What about your parents?" Chen Pingan asked. The skinny little girl continued to crunch on roasted sunflower seeds as she smiled and replied, "They died ages ago. I'm not from the capital, I came from a place thousands of kilometers away from here. My hometown was struck by some plague, and I was still very little at that time. I fled with my mom and dad, but my mom died during the journey. It was my dad who brought me here, and the officials in the capital were truly quite kind. They set up many porridge stalls outside the city, and my dad only died after drinking a large bowl of porridge. How old are you this year? Chun Ping'an asked. After finishing off the rest of her roasted sunflower seeds, the skinny little girl held up both hands and bent a single thumb, waving her fingers around as she replied, I'm 9 years old. Chun Ping'an didn't say anything else. The skinny little girl laughed and said, I don't look like I'm 9 years old, right? This can't be helped. I'm always hungry, so I naturally can't grow tall. Did you see the girl who gave me a small snowman before? She was only 6 years old, yet she was already a bit taller than me. The little scholar in this courtyard, that Chao Qinglang, he's also younger than me. Chun Ping'an lightly rocked the straw fan back and forth, appearing unmoved and apathetic. The skinny little girl was actually observing Chun Ping'an's expression the entire time, so she couldn't help but grumble in her mind when she saw his cold indifference toward her plight. Sure enough, rich people were all bad people. They never cared about the life and death of others, regardless of how wealthy and influential they were. He could clearly give her a good life if he just allowed a few pieces of silver to slip out from between his fingers, yet he stubbornly refused to offer her any help. She was already 9 years old, yet she was so emaciated and short that she appeared like a 5 or 6-year-old child instead. However, Chun Ping'an didn't find this strange because he had also gone through the same thing when he was her age. It was only after he left Clay Vase Alley and the small town and started to work as an apprentice in Old Man Yao's dragon kiln that he started to grow taller and stronger. Before that, Chun Ping'an had been half a head shorter than the other children the same age as him. Chun Ping'an didn't remove deep infatuation and halting snow from his hips today, so he appeared extremely dignified and mighty even though he was sitting on a small stool. It was also because of this that the skinny little girl was behaving so well tonight. A gentle breeze brushed over Chun Ping'an as he rocked the straw fan and he asked, How much did you sell those stolen books for? The skinny little girl scrunched up her face, trying to force some tears from her eyes. However, she failed to produce any tears, so she could only raise a hand and cry injustice with a sobbing tone, saying, I genuinely didn't steal any books. I swear. If I'm lying, then the heavens will unleash thunder and lightning and deal the punishment of a wretched death. Chun Ping'an chuckled and asked, If you're lying, then who's going to be punished with a wretched death by the thunder and lightning of the heavens? I don't think you made this clear. The skinny little girl's expression changed slightly, and she smiled dryly as she replied, Me, of course. Who else could it be? Chun Ping'an nodded and asked, Then who are you? What's your name? The skinny little girl leaned down and lowered her head, using her finger to push the pile of shells around as she replied, I have a surname, but I don't have a name. My parents died too early, and they didn't have the chance to give me a name. After saying this, she looked up with a dazzling smile and continued, But my dad once told me that our ancestors were extremely rich. Some of them were very, very powerful officials, and they were responsible for managing many thousands of people. Chun Ping'an stopped rocking the straw fan, and he swirled his wine gourd around as he asked, Do you miss your parents? Why would I miss them? I don't even remember their faces, the skinny little girl replied instinctively. However, she was most likely aware that such a reply wouldn't sit well with most people, so she immediately changed her tune and added, In fact, I do think about them all the time. I often dream about them, but it's a shame that I can't see their appearances clearly. Every time I dream of them, I'll wake up in the morning with tears drenching my face. It makes me so sad. Chun Ping'an turned around to look at her. The skinny little girl raised her hand and exclaimed, I swear. Are you truly unafraid of the heavens? Chun Ping'an asked. This skinny little girl was slightly angry, yet she still didn't dare to talk back to Chun Ping'an. She hurriedly lowered her head and mumbled, The heavens my ass. Chun Ping'an stood up and put the straw fan back on the small stool. He then walked out of the courtyard, arriving in front of someone standing in the corner of the alley with no name. This person was wearing a silver-colored lotus flower hat, and his appearance and stature were both like that of a little child. There was a long sword strapped diagonally across his back. Chun Ping'an walked to the corner of the alley, and the person had already retreated to the opposite side of the intersecting street. This could be regarded as an expression of his attitude. He wasn't here to provoke Chen Ping'an, and was instead here to discuss other matters. Chen Ping'an didn't have a very good impression of this person. He was Eugenie, the leader of Lake Mountain faction and the leader of the so-called righteous forces. He was also the second most powerful person in the world, and someone who had secretly joined forces with Ding Ying in the past. Eugenie smiled faintly and said, "I've turned around and come back to the capital of Southern Garden Nation for two reasons, one official and one personal. The official matter pertains to my desire to have a conversation with Zhong Qiu, and ask him to hand that 5 Mountains picture album to me. I can relocate to Southern Garden Nation along with my Lake Mountain faction, and I can promise that I won't fight Zhong Qiu for the position of Imperial Preceptor. In terms of the personal matter, I want to ask you whether you possess any so-called immortal currency, as the otherworldly immortals like to put it. For example, snowflake coins, lesser heat coins, or grain rain coins. As long as you have some on you, any kind will do. I'm willing to offer something in exchange, and I can help you obtain anything you want as long as it exists in the lotus flower blessed land. If there's genuinely something I want, will I not be able to find it myself?" Chen Ping'an retorted. Eugenie shook his head and replied, "Why waste your time? I'm more familiar with the cultivation world and officialdom of the 4 nations, after all, and it's common knowledge that time is the most important resource to cultivators. On the other hand, the 3 types of immortal currencies used by otherworldly immortals were the physical manifestation of the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Eugenie, whose sole intent was to attain Tao and achieve longevity, desperately needed this kind of immortal currency. Moreover, he was the only person who could afford to make an exchange for them. Eugenie pointed at the colored glaze flying sword that he was carrying on his back before continuing. "Chen Ping'an, apart from offering you this sword as part of the exchange, I can even go around the lotus flower blessed land and personally gather all of the relics left behind by the otherworldly immortals. In fact, I can even obtain the immortal treasures received by Tang Qie, Monk Yunny, and the others and offer them to you. Moreover, you're a pure martial artist, and the 3 demonic factions under Ding Ying's demonic force, as well as Tong Qingqing's Mirror Heart Hall, are all martial arts holy lands that hold a large number of secret martial arts scriptures. Perhaps there'll be something that interests you. You definitely came to look for me first after entering the capital, and your purpose is to complete this transaction. I can also confirm that you're indeed sincere in your desire to complete this transaction. However, you also want to borrow this opportunity to put pressure on Imperial Preceptor Zhong, don't you?" Chen Ping'an asked. "Once I nod and accept your proposal, a significant amount of pressure will then fall on Imperial Preceptor Zhong and Southern Garden Nation. In addition, you're offering to personally collect secret martial arts scriptures for me. But is this not a case of wielding the might and influence of the most powerful and second most powerful cultivators in the world to put pressure on the entire cultivation world? Are you not forcing them to give you open access to those incomplete scriptures brought here by the otherworldly immortals? Eugenie, regardless of how powerful you are, you don't dare to challenge the entire world by yourself. After all, martial arts maniac Zhu Lian and the demonic forces Ding Ying are both examples of what will happen." Eugenie didn't deny this, and he nodded and replied, "But you still stand to benefit from this exchange. Moreover, you don't need to do anything from the beginning until the end. I'll be the bad person." Chen Ping'an drew his slender saber, halting snow from its scabbard. The colored glaze flying sword on Eugenie's back also started to ring, ready to leave its scabbard at any moment. Eugenie's expression was extremely dark. He hadn't imagined that Chen Ping'an would be so unreasonable. However, Chen Ping'an lowered his saber and used its tip to poke 2 small holes in the ground. He then drew a curve between the 2 holes and asked, "Your intention is good, and the outcome you seek is also good. However, is this reason for you to act in such an unscrupulous manner?" Eugenie glanced at the curved line in front of Chen Ping'an's feet before retracting his gaze and replying in an indifferent voice, "Those who seek to achieve great things don't dwell on trifling details. There's a notion of large and small pertaining to what we lose today and what we gain tomorrow, and the difference between the two is positively immense. I, Eugenie, feel no guilt in my heart. My conscience is clear, so why wouldn't I do this? During this time, several members of the upper 10 elites and lower 10 elites might be killed. Perhaps more than a dozen of them will be killed. However, what does this matter? Do you know how many tens of thousands of innocent people have been killed by otherworldly immortals in the history of this world? Disregarding those horrific wars and only focusing on the current members of the upper 10 elites whom you've interacted with, do you know how many people Springtide Palace's Zhou Fei has indiscriminately killed? Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, I've read many books. I don't dare to say that I know everything, but I do actually know quite a bit. In terms of wars that were likely triggered by otherworldly immortals in the history of this world, I can name a list of at least 60 right now. Eugenie didn't say anything else. Their aspirations and principles were different, so they would ultimately walk different paths. Chen Ping'an hesitated for a moment before squatting down and drawing 2 additional lines with his fingers. One line was straight, and one line was less curved than the original and located between the straight line and the original curved line. After standing up, Chen Ping'an explained, I won't demand you, Eugenie, to become a sage of morality. I don't have the ability to demand this of you either. Moreover, I can't label your actions as incorrect at this specific moment. However, setting all of this aside, I won't engage in any transaction with you. I do possess immortal currency, and I possess quite a lot of immortal currency at that. However, I won't sell you a single coin. Eugenie narrowed his eyes and exclaimed, Oh! Chen Ping'an smiled and remarked, What, are you feeling ticked off? That's very good then, and that makes me feel quite happy. A beaming smile suddenly spread across Eugenie's face and he said, I hope we'll meet again in the future. The colored glaze flying sword instantly left its scabbard, hovering beside Eugenie's feet and allowing him to step on. He was preparing to leave the capital of Southern Garden Nation on his flying sword. As for Zhongqiu, there was no need to seek an audience with him anymore. Just as Chen Ping'an had said, he would only have an opportunity to persuade the imperial preceptor if Chen Ping'an nodded and agreed to his proposal. Eugenie had only risen 3 meters into the air when he heard that person chuckle and say, Shorty, it's best that we don't meet again in the future. Killing intent instantly exploded from Eugenie's body, and he turned the tip of his flying sword around to coldly glare at that young otherworldly immortal who had disparaged him. Chen Ping'an's expression remained calm as he asked, Eugenie, do you feel like you've suffered unacceptable humiliation simply because I insulted you and called you a shorty? Do you think you're all that terribly impressive because you're cultivating Dao power and have become an immortal? Chen Ping'an's hands were already resting on the hilts of deep infatuation and halting snow. Eugenie humped coldly and rose into the sky, transforming into a bright streak of light as he soared away into the distance. Chen Ping'an turned around and returned to the alley. A little child who was poking their head around the corner hurriedly shrunk back and ran away. The skinny little girl couldn't help but sigh in disappointment as she ran. Just how great would it have been if the two of them had fought and ended up killing each other? Chen Ping'an returned to the courtyard and shut the door behind him. Near the kitchen door, the skinny little girl was sitting on a small stool with her head cocked to the side and pretending to be asleep. Meanwhile, Chao Qinglang had put out his oil lamp and gone to sleep. He entered his room and removed his blades. He then started to read, poring over the books about building bridges. Everything remained peaceful and calm afterward. This was the case for the capital of Southern Garden Nation, and it also seemed to be the case for the entire world. Just like that, accompanied by the rustling of pages as Chen Ping'an continued to study those books, the final solar term of summer slowly transitioned into the first solar term of autumn. The old Taoist priest didn't visit him again, so Chen Ping'an could only remain in this world and wait. His hometown Jewel Small World had once been a jewel hanging in the sky above the Greatly Empire. The utterly broken golden millet-blessed land in Stalactite Mountain was a blessed land that even immortals would have an extremely difficult time finding. That being the case, heavens knew just what exactly the lotus flower-blessed land was, and just where exactly in Parasol Leaf Continent it was located. The private school near the small alley with no name still hadn't reopened. The skinny little girl shamelessly stayed in Chao Qinglang's house. However, she had finally learned how to fetch water and sweep the ground every day, even though she would still cut corners and slack off whenever she could. Generally speaking, ordinary families in the towns and cities could start looking forward to the full moon of the Mid-Autumn Festival when the first solar term of autumn arrived. This was especially the case for children, who would eagerly look up with wide eyes and excitedly count down the days on their fingers. There would be family reunions where everyone enjoyed mooncakes as they gazed up at that bright and full moon. And the sound of lively chatter and laughter would also ring through the streets and alleys. Enjoying the cool breeze in the courtyard tonight, Qian Ping'an suddenly realized that neither he nor Chao Qinglang or the skinny little girl would look forward to the Mid-Autumn Festival. Regardless, Chao Qinglang was smiling much more lately. There would naturally be times when he genuinely became annoyed at that skinny little girl whose mouth was as toxic as arsenic, but after a while, the relationship between the two of them would once again return to normal. He didn't bear grudges. Chao Qinglang would sometimes argue with the skinny little girl, but how could he possibly be a match for her? On one occasion, he had been scolded so badly that the rims of his eyes had gone bright red, with his lips also quivering in anger. However, Chao Qinglang had still quietly given her some roasted sunflower seeds when she had asked for them that night, saying that there was only that much left. Upon hearing this, the skinny little girl had said, "Then hurry up and buy some more if there's none left. Just how old are you already? Do you need me to teach you how to buy something?" This had caused Chao Qinglang to be in low spirits for the remainder of the night, where he had also refused to speak with her. However, the skinny little girl naturally wouldn't care about this, and she had happily snacked on the roasted sunflower seeds by herself. When the skinny little girl chatted with him, she never cared whether he replied or not, and she simply said what she wanted to say. Chao Qinglang would roll his eyes, and when he truly couldn't tolerate it anymore, he would head back to his room to read. Sometimes, he would also muster the courage to turn around and shoot a glare at her. However, the skinny little girl would glare back and feign picking up her small stool to beat him up. This would frighten Chao Qinglang into hurriedly running back to his room and shutting the door. Resting his arms and head on the windowsill, Chao Qinglang would see Qian Ping'an glance at that bad little girl, after which she would hurriedly sit up straight and explain that she was only messing around with Chao Qinglang, and that the relationship between them was all fine and dandy. When he saw this, Chao Qinglang would smile happily before lighting his oil lamp and starting to read. This was also the true reason why Qian Ping'an didn't shoo the skinny little girl away. It suddenly started to rain one morning, and an obsequious smile appeared on the skinny little girl's face as she carried back half a bucket of water that could be either well water or rainwater. After returning to the courtyard, she went over to Qian Ping'an and informed him that the private school had reopened. On this day, Qian Ping'an held an oil paper umbrella and accompanied Chao Qinglang to the private school. The two of them walked along the small alley with no name. Initially standing under the eaves to hide from the rain, the skinny little girl jogged to the entrance of the courtyard and saw Qian Ping'an holding that umbrella and secretly tilting it toward Chao Qinglang. The two of them appeared to be chatting with each other, with Chao Qinglang speaking more and Qian Ping'an looking at him and listening with a faint smile. The skinny little girl stood there for a very long time. The human heart wasn't like the streets. It couldn't be washed clean after a heavy downpour. In the eyes of the emperor and officials and peddlers and commoners in the capital, the shockwaves from the fight between the cultivators were still rippling without pause. When Qian Ping'an helped Zhongqiu teach Yan Shijing and the young girl fist techniques, their young friends who hung around and joined in on the fun were one of these ripples. After old General Liu left the city wall and bragged about his friendship with Qian Ping'an to his grandson and granddaughter, that was also one of the ripples. The many families moving away from Champion Scholar Alley were again a ripple. Ding Ying was dead, while Yu Zhini had stepped onto his flying sword and flown away. Thus, the mess was left to Zhongqiu to clean up. After accompanying Chao Qinglang to the private school, Qian Ping'an returned the same way that he had come, holding the oil paper umbrella in his hand as he walked along the silent and deserted streets. Following the imperial court's decision to gradually ease the enforcement of martial law in this district, one could already see a few people returning to the streets. However, the streets were still largely lifeless, and the people striding through them were mostly daring members of the cultivation world who had come here to admire the battlefield. They would click their tongues in wonder when they laid eyes on the extremely deep ditch in the ground caused by Lu Feng's sword strike. Bull Mountain and the surrounding areas were still sealed off, with the imperial court decreeing that anyone who dared enter without permission would be executed without mercy. Many officials from the Ministry of Astronomy appeared in this area, and the simple thatched cottage that Yu Zhini had constructed nearby was demolished as well. When the gallant travelers from the cultivation world saw Qian Ping'an, they simply treated him as a fellow member of the cultivation world, who had come here to admire the profound power of those grandmasters. Chen Ping'an hesitated for a moment before walking to that martial arts school and asking to enter. The doorkeeper saw that he didn't look like someone who was here to challenge the school or rip down their sign, and noticed that the young boy possessed a very powerful aura. Hence, he didn't dare to delay, and quickly went inside to inform the owner about this visitor. This was largely because Chen Ping'an was able to accurately describe the routines and methods of the martial arts school's fist techniques. As a result, he was able to leave a good impression on the old master after saying just a few words. It was evident that Chen Ping'an had indeed heard of the martial arts school's good reputation before. The true income of this martial arts school in the capital came from a few descendants of wealthy clans who dreamed of entering the martial arts world. It was thanks to the financial support of these wealthy pupils that the martial arts school had enough money to keep operating. Talented pupils were the foundation of this martial arts school, while the wealthy pupils who had come here to play were the face of this martial arts school. Each was as important as the other. The old master invited Chen Ping'an to the main hall, and instructed a pupil to bring some tea over. The two of them then started to chat. When they reached the topic of examining the dragon, something that related to the fundamental principles of martial arts, the old master didn't go too deep into the topic. However, he naturally wouldn't be so impolite either, so he casually picked a few surface-level concepts to talk about. At the same time, he also sighed with emotion and lamented that it was truly difficult to find pupils with good aptitude. If he were fortunate, he could find one good pupil every 4 to 5 years. If he were unfortunate, however, then he might not find a single good pupil in 10 years. The old master also explained that practicing fist techniques wasn't for the sole purpose of improving one's health. Rather, it was much like handing his pupils a sharp blade. Thus, martial virtue was the most important quality. Otherwise, if his pupils possessed poor character, then the more powerful they were, the more harm they would cause. They would relish bullying the weak and causing trouble, and they might even kill their victims in 2 or 3 punches. In the end, they would also implicate their fellow pupils and the martial arts school. Chen Ping'an asked some questions about external martial arts. The old master was evasive in the beginning, not willing to reveal too much. There was a troubled expression on his face. Chen Ping'an immediately put on an expression of realization, saying that he had forgotten some proper matters before retrieving 20 taels of silver and placing them on the tea table in front of them. Chen Ping'an explained that he planned to come here to learn fist techniques for the next while, although he couldn't guarantee that he would come every day. The old master's eyes lit up, and only then did he start to speak without reservations and reveal everything that he knew. He expounded to Chen Ping'an the most common and basic principles regarding fist techniques. Chen Ping'an committed everything to memory, and he attempted to find commonalities between these principles and the principles of the mountain shaking guide. After listening to the old master's explanation of these common and basic fist technique principles, Chen Ping'an finally decided that he would collect some martial arts scriptures from this world. He would collect a range of them from low level to high level, but he wouldn't collect too many of each. In the future, he could casually go over these scriptures when he took a break from practicing fist techniques. Perhaps he might even receive a pleasant surprise. This was just like how he had incorporated Zhongqiu's mountain peak fist stance into the Mountain Shaking Guide's 6-step walking meditation before. This act had allowed Chen Ping'an to break through the barrier of the 4th tier and soar to the 5th tier in a single go. Moreover, the process had been as smooth and natural as could be. Thinking back to Ding Ying's aura when he walked into the Great Hall of White River Temple, and considering Zhongqiu's aura when he approached Chen Ping'an for the first time, Chen Ping'an felt like the so-called act of becoming one with the heavens practiced in this world was full of mystery and secrets. Perhaps he would obtain some benefits from this knowledge when he returned to Majestic World. Moreover, it was extremely likely that the key opportunity pertaining to his advance from the 5th tier to the 6th tier had something to do with this concept. Chen Ping'an speculated that he would descend into a state of sluggish cultivation after leaving the lotus flower-blessed land. This would be similar to what Fan Wanner had experienced outside the main hall of White River Temple back then, as if there were heavy boulders weighing on her shoulders as she slogged her way through thick mud. It would also feel similar to those times in the past when Old Man Yang had stuck 4 true Qi talismans to his hands and feet. Ever since starting to practice fist techniques, this was the first time that his fists had become alive. He was finally attempting to consider the gains and losses of his techniques. A good example of this was comprehending Zhong Qiu's mountain peak fist stance while fighting against the imperial preceptor. In the beginning, Chen Ping'an had practiced the mountain-shaking fist for the sake of staying alive. He had practiced the fist technique as earnestly as he could, and he had followed the mountain-shaking guide to a T without daring to deviate a single bit. He had practiced the 6-step walking meditation and the sword furnace standing meditation again and again, almost to the state where they had become second nature and fused together with his soul. Even when Cui Chan's grandfather taught him fist techniques in the bamboo building afterward, Chen Ping'an had still done exactly as the old man had told him. This wasn't to say that adhering strictly to the fist techniques was a bad thing. If Cui Chan's grandfather saw it, he would label it half-dead and barely alive. And this was a very difficult state to reach, yet it still wasn't enough. If he wanted to progress further, simply being able to endure pain and hardship wouldn't be enough. He would need to encounter the correct fated opportunities to attain enlightenment. Outsiders couldn't reveal the answer, and even if they did, it would do him no good. What Chen Ping'an didn't realize was the fact that he had only attained such enlightenment after throwing more than 1 million punches. Meanwhile, he had learned to manipulate sword techniques in a lively manner very early on. There was Mr. Qi's sword strike outside the rundown temple that had shattered Lu Qiqing's technique, the sword spirit sword strike in the scholarly sage's picture scroll, and his sword strike toward Middle-earth Divine Continent's Tassel Mountain. All of these had already become Chen Ping'an's sword techniques. Yang had once said that Chen Ping'an would definitely enjoy more success with the sword than with his fists. The loftier and more profound the fist techniques and sword techniques of one's teachers, the more difficult it would be for one to transform these dead techniques into living techniques. Just how difficult was this task? Zheng Dafeng was a good example of just how incredibly challenging this was. His talent was sufficient and his cultivation base was also high enough. He had already been a mighty 8th-tier martial artist, yet it was only when he reached the brink of death in Old Dragon City that the words of Chen Ping'an, an outsider, had allowed him to comprehend the principle of a disciple not having to be inferior to their master. It was only because of this that he had managed to break through the barrier and advance to the 9th tier. Practicing fist techniques required one to cultivate one's mind. Chen Ping'an had twice asked Zhong Qiu's young direct disciple, Yin Shijing, why he hadn't dared to throw a punch. However, why hadn't Zhong Qiu felt overly disappointed in Yin Shijing? This wasn't because Zhong Qiu lacked high hopes in the young boy, but rather because Chen Ping'an had already given the answer. Zhong Qiu had taught his disciples the principle of not using their fists rashly, and it was perhaps the case that Yin Shijing was still unable to achieve this. On the other hand, after practicing fist techniques for so long and experiencing so many battles, Chen Ping'an was already able to speak and achieve the principle of not retreating even if he were facing the founders of the 3 teachings. Since Yin Shijing was still unable to grasp the essence of his master's principles, there was naturally no need to be excessively strict on him. There were many intricacies regarding this, and one truly needed to travel through the cultivation world and throw 1 million punches by themselves to truly attain enlightenment. Through listening to Yin Shijing and his junior sister's conversation, Chen Ping'an had already become aware of his unusual nature. Regardless of whether it was Zhong Qiu's supremely talented disciples, the demonic forces Yer or Zhou Fei's son Zhou Shi, they were surprisingly all inferior to Chen Ping'an when it came to both cultivation talent and character. Even so, Chen Ping'an was still unable to clearly understand his peerless standing in the lotus flower-blessed land. Fortunately, however, he was at least able to vaguely sense his ability to become one with the heavens. This was not just a solid step forward for pure martial artists, but a solid leap. It was a fated opportunity for the mind's realm that most 8th tier and 9th tier martial artists in Majestic World wouldn't be able to experience. Chen Ping'an left the martial arts school and returned to the courtyard in the small alley. The skinny little girl was sitting under the eaves and zoning out, and the heavy downpour had already transformed into a light drizzle. The skinny little girl cracked a smile when she saw Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an discovered that her clothes had been slightly drenched by the rain, but he pretended that he didn't see anything at all. He grabbed the box that held the broken pipa and prepared to visit the impoverished scholar with the surname Jiang who lived 4 districts away. It wasn't exactly close. When Chen Ping'an finally left the courtyard and walked out of the small alley, The skinny little girl ran over in a furtive manner and hurriedly bolted the courtyard door shut. She then stood under the eaves and started to practice fist techniques in a seemingly proper manner. She had stolen this stance from Chan Ping'an, the stance where he emulated Dinging, as well as the blind old Taoist priest's lightning technique stance. One of her palms faced the sky, and her other hand was clenched into a fist in front of her as she slowly walked forward. The basic threshold for both of these stances was incredibly high. One was the stance of Dinging, previously the most powerful person in this world, and one was a stance that pertained to the lightning element techniques of chi refiners. To say nothing of the skinny little girl, who had never practiced fist techniques before, even Chan Ping'an was only barely able to imitate the stance, with no true intent to speak of. The skinny little girl felt slightly bored after emulating this fist technique for a while, so she started assuming other stances that she had stolen from people on the streets. There was one of Zhong Qiu's fist stances, there was Lu Feng's stance when he had carved that deep ditch into the street, and there was Chan Ping'an's six-step walking meditation. The skinny little girl stumbled around awkwardly, and it was clear that she was unable to even emulate the most basic forms of these stances. After mucking around for a long time, the skinny little girl let out a shout and performed a vicious roundhouse kick. However, she ended up crashing to the ground in a brutal manner. She felt a little hungry after picking herself back up, so she limped over to the kitchen to steal some food. The skinny little girl felt like she had already mastered a host of profound martial arts techniques, so she planned to use Chao Qinglang as a training dummy when he returned from school. Of course, she would naturally pick a time when Chan Ping'an wasn't present. Chan Ping'an frowned as he watched her mucking around from a nearby rooftop. After a while, he left without making a sound. When chatting with her last night, Chan Ping'an had asked her how old she was. She had replied 9, and she had casually raised both hands and bent one of her thumbs to show that number. In addition to this, Chan Ping'an had carefully observed her breathing and footsteps when she had fetched water from the well. Walking along the street with an umbrella in his hand, Chan Ping'an decided that he wouldn't practice walking meditation in the small courtyard again in the future. Zhang Quan was an impoverished scholar, and he had studied hard despite his situation for over 10 years. He had memorized many poems and books, and was widely recognized as a child prodigy and then a talented scholar in his home country. However, he had failed to pass the imperial examination, yet he didn't blame the heavens or other people even though he was in such a miserable state right now. He was renting a place with some fellow scholars from his hometown, and he continued to study earnestly every single day. However, there was a faint hint of worry between his brows, and he would walk into the alley as if waiting for someone after becoming tired from studying every day. Zhang Quan's 2 housemates were aware of his worries, so they brought him to a nearby bookstore to purchase some books today. Even though they said this, the 3 scholars were actually too poor to afford anything fancy. They flipped through some copies of sagely books that were relatively rare, and they glanced at those lone copies and rare copies of books about stunning beauties in the distance. This was simply to satisfy their eyes. Under the shopkeeper's annoyed gaze, the 3 impoverished scholars finally huffed and walked out of the bookstore. As they came out the door, they saw a young boy holding an umbrella and carrying a case on his back standing outside. The young boy looked at Zhang Quan and asked, "Are you Zhang Quan? I'm Gu Ling's relative from the capital, and I have something to discuss with you." Delight instantly spread across Zhang Quan's face, and he exclaimed in excitement, that's me, I'm Zhang Quan, all right. Where is she?" The capital of Southern Garden Nation was quite dangerous right now, yet Gu Ling had vanished without a trace after heading over to borrow money from her relatives last time. Not only that, but someone had even died in an alley near where he lived. Back then, the administrative soldiers had angrily broken up the crowds and shooed them away. Afterward, they had covered up the corpse and took it away. As a result, Zhang Quan only heard that the victim was a woman from the cultivation world who had died a tragic death, with some people speculating that she had died due to someone exacting revenge. This made him feel extremely anxious and uneasy. As the days went on, this feeling intensified to the state where he couldn't even calm his mind to properly read anymore. The young boy looked at him and said, "Our Gu clan is a clan of officials in the capital, so even though the branch clan that Gu Ling belongs to is a failure in terms of scholarly pursuit, it is still ultimately part of our Gu clan after all. I've heard that some members of this branch clan have even entered the cultivation world. but they've been too embarrassed to contact us for quite some years. Gu Ling voluntarily sought us out this time. Yet the first thing she said was that she needed to borrow money. The seniors in the clan were fairly unhappy, and this wasn't because they cared about some measly amount of silver. Rather, they felt was an embarrassment to their clan and a humiliation of their clan culture. So they were unwilling to acknowledge her as a relative. Even so, Gu Ling still insisted on borrowing some silver, and she even promised that you would definitely pass the imperial examination in the future. Because of this, it wouldn't take her long to repay the debt. Not only that, but the scholar would even organize an official wedding with her. However, the seniors in the clan are well aware of just how difficult it is to pass the imperial examination. That being the case, how could they believe that an impoverished scholar would pass the imperial examination and gain a scholarly title? In the end, they asked Gu Ling for this pipa and only agreed to lend money to her after obtaining it. At the same time, they also asked her to agree to one condition. That is, they'll only allow the two of you to reunite after you pass the imperial examination and become a Jinsher. One, she's already returning to the main clan now, and she most definitely won't exchange any letters with you. Chen Ping'an grabbed the case from his back and handed it to Jiang Quan. He then took out a bulging sack of silver and said, "There are 50 taels of silver inside and also 2 bank notes. Spend the money wisely, and it will be more than enough to last you until the next imperial examination. Jiang Quan, if you're not confident that you can pass the imperial examination, I can actually help deliver a message to Gu Ling and suggest that the two of you elope instead. With one of you abandoning your clan values and one of you abandoning the sagely books, you'll be a perfect match for each other, and you'll still at least be able to survive. In my opinion, this is better than suffering for 3 years and still being openly broken up by your elders and seniors in the future." Oh, that's right, the seniors in the clan were very angry at her being so persistent, so they smashed her pipa and caused it to break. You can buy her a new one if you get the chance in the future. Jiang Quan was completely dumbfounded. The impoverished scholar didn't doubt that the young boy in front of him was genuinely a descendant of a wealthy clan. In fact, Jiang Quan felt a slight sense of shame and inferiority as he stood in front of this person. "Why are you helping me?" he asked in a nervous voice. "I'm not helping you, I'm helping Gu Ling," Chen Ping'an replied. Jiang Quan accepted the pipa, but didn't accept the bag of coins. There was curiosity in his voice as he asked, "Aren't you a descendant of the Gu clan? Why are you willing to favor Miss Gu instead?" "Since Gu Ling likes you so much, I wanted to come here to see just what kind of person you are." Chen Ping'an fell silent for a moment before slowly continuing. "The books say, if love between both sides can last for aye." An understanding smile appeared on Jiang Quan's face, and a wisp of confidence welled up in his heart as he nodded earnestly in self-encouragement and finished, "Why need they stay together night and day?" "Too." Jiang Quan then shook his head and said, "I don't need the money. Setting up a stall and writing letters, couplets, and other things for people is always an option to keep myself fed and sheltered. There's no reason for me to accept this money and cause Miss Gu to suffer back at home. I don't want her to get the side eye from other people. However, I need to trouble you with writing a letter to her. Tell her to wait for me, to wait for the day that I obtain the title of Jinsher." A beaming smile appeared on his face as he dreamed. Perhaps she can even become an honorary lady in the future. However, he hurriedly shook his hands and said, "Please don't include this in the letter. I might not be able to achieve it, so I'll simply keep this aspiration in my heart. If I genuinely succeed one day, then I'll bring her over to visit you and have her know that I already aspired to achieve this a long time ago." Chen Ping'an was also a strange person, and he insisted on giving the bag of silver to Jiang Quan. He finished with a strange remark saying, "You definitely have to accept this silver. This is Gu Ling's will. This is also the cleanest silver in the world." The two other scholars also encouraged Jiang Quan to accept the bag of silver. The young boy turned around and left. "Little brother, how will I find you after I pass the imperial examination?" Jiang Quan asked loudly. Chen Ping'an turned around and replied, "Someone will find you and tell you everything if you pass the imperial examination." A light drizzle descended upon the world again. Jiang Quan left the marketplace with his 2 good friends. Standing far away, that messenger held an umbrella under the eaves as he watched the impoverished scholar slowly disappear into the distance. The old Taoist priest appeared beside Chen Ping'an and asked with a smile, Why didn't you directly tell him the truth? To tell him nothing, to tell him everything, or to have Imperial Preceptor Zhong tell him everything in 3 years regardless of whether Jiang Quan passes the Imperial examination or not. I feel like the third option is better for both him and Gu Ling, Chen Ping'an replied in a soft voice. The old Taoist priest then posed a question aimed right at the very depths of Chen Ping'an's heart. Then which option would have made your heart feel the most at ease? I would have gone with the first option before entering the lotus flower-blessed land, Chen Ping'an replied. Everyone should take responsibility for their own life and death when traveling through the cultivation world. Now, however, I would most likely pick the second option. This is the simplest way for me to keep a clear conscience. It won't leave any impurities in my mind's realm. As for why I picked the third option, I don't know either. In reality, I'm not sure whether my choice was correct or incorrect. Not sure whether it was correct or incorrect, you say? The old Taoist priest asked with a chuckle. What's wrong? Asked Chen Ping'an. The old Taoist placed a hand on Chen Ping'an's shoulder and announced, then you'll be even more confused in a moment. In the next instant, dawn arrived and the sun appeared above the horizon in the east. Standing before the palatial gate in the capital of Southern Garden Nation, the imperial gatekeeper unleashed a bellowing roar. Chen Ping'an, who was forced to put his umbrella away, could only shake his head in response. The imperial palace needs to borrow the first light of dawn to drive back some wronged souls, the old Taoist priest explained. Do you know who these wronged souls belong to? Chen Ping'an shook his head again. They belong to those loyal officials who died unjust deaths throughout the history of the nation. They belong to those upright officials who were unjustly executed, and to those pillar officials executed for their continuous advice to the emperor, the old Taoist priest revealed. Afterward, the river of time in the lotus flower-blessed land fell under the whimsical control of the old Taoist priest. It was as if 1 year, 10 years, or 100 years would flash by at his whim. In the next moment, the old Taoist priest led Chen Ping'an in front of an old scholar who was still studying earnestly even though his hair had already become snow-white. He wrote poems and essays as if he were assisted by the gods, yet he established few rules and put few restrictions on his descendants. After his passing, his children and grandchildren traveled around to peddle his life's work. However, failing to sell anything, they eventually decided to burn it all in a fit of incandescent rage. Chen Ping'an also saw a prime minister from a poor background who finally managed to write a genuinely wealthy poem in his twilight years. Only then were his essays not ridiculed and personified as someone wearing gold and decorated in silver, but still walking around in a pair of straw sandals. He saw an impoverished pillar official with nothing but pure wind in his sleeves. He enjoyed great popularity and reputation among the people, yet his relatives in the regions were filthy rich and always oppressed other people. Knowing this, the pillar official always spoke sincerely and warned his relatives to be diligent and frugal in his letters back home. He reminded them to leave moral principles and not wealth as heirlooms for the future generations. Once the contents of these letters were made known to the world, his actions and deeds became a story praised by everyone. A prince of northern Jian nation breathed into his hands to warm them as he stood outside the classroom on a snowy day. A profligate person acted wantonly and committed all kinds of crimes outside. Yet he was extremely dutiful toward his grandma when he returned home, silently helping her tuck the blankets in at night. A pillar official of Pine Song Nation made every effort to reform and improve his nation. However, of his 7 or 8 direct descendants, more than half of them seized the opportunity of political reform to seek personal gain. They plotted against their opponents and speculated on the emperor's thoughts. In the end, their secret alliances and factions caused the political reform to end in failure. Even so, the pillar official was still filled with righteous fervor when he was thrown into jail. He simply regretted the fact that he would die before fulfilling his ambition. A young traveler in the cultivation world was cornered and filled with desperation. His parents had been killed in an act of revenge, and he had endured over a dozen years of humiliation and hardship to finally avenge their deaths. He killed dozens of members of the culprit's family, wreaking vengeance to his heart's content. No longer a young traveler and now a powerful martial artist, the man hadn't noticed the little girl and the even younger boy in the residence. The siblings had coincidentally been playing hide-and-seek and hiding inside a double wall, so they had escaped the wretched fate of being killed by the vengeful man. In the end, The two little children kowtowed in front of the grave mounds and made the resolve to exact revenge. There were two similar cases of delivering documents, and both cases had encountered problems that required the imperial court to interrogate the relevant county magistrate. One county magistrate secretly offered the postal official a brilliant plan, telling him to fabricate his report and claim that he had encountered bandits during his trip. He even told the postal official to cut himself with his saber to make things appear more convincing. In the end, they managed to satisfy the imperial court and avoid any punishment. In the other case, the road had clearly been blocked due to a severe snowstorm. Even so, the postal official had still forcefully crossed the river in order to complete his mission. Only after handing over the document had he slipped into the river and suffered serious injuries. The county magistrate truthfully reported the matter. Yet the final outcome was the postal official being caned 100 times and being banished 500 kilometers away. Meanwhile, the county magistrate also lost his official salary for a year. He was graded as low-performing, and he would have no opportunity to be promoted for the next 5 years. Things became even stranger afterward, and the river of time surprisingly started to flow in reverse. He saw Feng Qingbai and Tang Qie getting along and calling each other brothers, with the two of them sitting opposite each other in a border city and drinking and patting their knees as they sang loudly. Qian Ping'an also arrived outside the capital of Southern Garden Nation, where he saw Gu Ling meet the impoverished scholar Jiang Quan for the first time. He saw their reunion and their growing familiarity, and their intimacy and their love for each other. It snowed heavily before they entered the capital, and Gu Ling, who had just completed an assassination, accompanied Jiang Quan into the capital to attend the imperial examination. Standing in the snow by herself, the woman who had met a scholar this year felt as if she had experienced another bout of snow in her dark and bloody life. The ground became sparkling clean, and she almost mistook herself for the best woman in the world, even though she knew that the snow would eventually melt, revealing her true colors as a sinister woman again. Being able to experience this relationship was truly a blessing from the heavens. The heavens hadn't treated her badly. Qian Ping'an saw a skinny little girl, and she would occasionally venture outside the capital to steal a few glances at some small grave mound that was covered in tall grass. In the end, Qian Ping'an saw himself taking a glance at that well. He entered that private scripture library twice to pore through books, and more than half of the tens of thousands of books in the scripture library were completely brand new. There were many books that would still give off the fragrance of ink, even when they were opened many years later. There were so many sagely principles and beautiful poems and essays, yet not a single person to discover and appreciate them. He stood outside the courtyard door in the small alley with no name, and he raised his hand before lowering it again several times in a row, not daring to knock on the door. When he and Chao Qinglang walked to the private school with an umbrella over their heads, the skinny little girl stood at the entrance of the courtyard and stared intently at their vanishing figures, completely unaware that her face was already drenched in rainwater. In the end, Qian Ping'an stood by himself under the eaves, the oil paper umbrella that had accompanied him for many years still in his hand. A light drizzle was still falling onto the street. However, the old Taoist priest was no longer standing beside him. Right and wrong, good and bad, righteous and wicked, moral and immoral. Qian Ping'an had witnessed many things. However, he hadn't managed to decipher a universal principle that held true no matter the situation. Instead, many principles that he had staunchly viewed as reasonable no longer seemed so reasonable. Qian Ping'an involuntarily recalled that old boatman he had met after experiencing the perilous calamity on Osmanthus Island. That old boatman had taken Lu Chun around the seas in the past, and he had looked at Qian Ping'an and said, "Don't try to ruin my great Tao." Before experiencing all of this, Qian Ping'an had already decided that he would choose Zhou Shi as one of the 5 people to take out of the lotus flower-blessed land if he was indeed given this opportunity, which Zhong Qiu had speculated he would. Qian Ping'an had made this decision even though he was aware that Zhou Shi wasn't the true culprit. After bringing Zhou Shi into Majestic World, he would then kill him with a single punch. Before this, he had also been filled with disgust and loathing toward that skinny little girl. He hadn't known why this was, and he hadn't even been willing to contemplate this question and understand his negative emotions. However, this wasn't without benefit. In the beginning, he had felt like he had wasted an extra snowflake coin, even though he had placed the snowflake coin beside a line of poetry that he found extremely beautiful. The rain cleared and warm rays of sunshine shone down. Qian Ping'an walked all the way to that well, where he stood and looked down toward its bottom. It was also at this moment that the skinny little girl in the small courtyard looked up at the blinding sun.
Observing Dao Temple. Dao observing Dao. 3.
The old Taoist priest was sitting in the sky and observing the two of them. In the lotus flower world that bordered the lotus flower blessed land, a Taoist priest was sitting beside the lotus pond and observing the three of them. According to the explanation of one of his disciples, he was simply bored and observing the small Tao of other people. Qian Ping'an suddenly retracted his gaze and started to chuckle. He walked away from the well. Even though he hadn't made heads or tails of anything, he had managed to figure one thing out. That annoying little girl. He needed to teach her some principles of etiquette and morality. He would begin from the most simple principles, and if he were still unable to make her understand and change, then he wouldn't need to worry about forcing her to change anymore. However, he would still teach her these principles. At the very least, she would understand the concepts of good and bad. In terms of whether she performed good deeds or bad deeds in the future, that would be entirely up to her. A cloudy expression appeared on the old Taoist priest's face. He wasn't in a good mood, and was just about to toss Qian Ping'an out of the lotus flower blessed land. He had actually failed to win against that old scholar. Thus, he flicked his sleeve and caused Qian Ping'an's next step to take him out of the lotus flower blessed land. The young boy surprisingly arrived on the post road outside northern Jian Nation in Parasol Leaf Continent. He was wearing golden sweet wine and carrying his sword nurturing gourd. Yet lasting qi was no longer strapped to his back. However, he was still at the 5th tier of martial arts, and his cultivation base hadn't vanished together with the lotus flower blessed land. Moreover, 1st and 15th, the two flying swords with which he had a mental connection, were both inside the sword nurturing gourd. Qian Ping'an hurriedly looked around, and he breathed a sigh of relief when he saw the little lotus spirit poking its head around further down the road. It was clear that the little lotus spirit was even more confused than Qian Ping'an. The old Taoist priest appeared beside him and said, "According to our agreement, you can bring 5 people out from the lotus flower blessed land. I've already picked 4 of them for you." The old Taoist priest held 4 picture scrolls in his hand, and with a casual toss, they flew into the air and hovered in a line in front of Qian Ping'an. The first picture scroll automatically unfurled, revealing a man in dragon robes sitting on a throne. "This is Wei Xian, the founding emperor of Southern Garden Nation," the old Taoist priest introduced. Another picture scroll unfurled, revealing a woman carrying a sword on her back. "This is Sui Yubian. She abandoned martial arts, and she has the potential to become a sword immortal. This is Liu Baixiang, the founder of the demonic forces. These 4 people possess complete physical bodies and souls. Before they come into this world, you need to use grain rain coins to feed the picture scrolls every day. If you stick at it, there'll eventually come a day when they eat their fill and become capable of walking out of the picture scrolls. They'll heed your command, and they'll loyally serve you to the death. In terms of how their martial arts cultivation base will progress in the future, and whether they choose to become qi refiners instead, that's completely up to your abilities as their owner. Of course, the prerequisite is that you can afford to raise these 4 people." The old Taoist priest was clearly unwilling to say anything extra to Qian Ping'an. He didn't give Qian Ping'an the opportunity to interrupt either, and he had quickly explained all of these things in a single burst. Before Qian Ping'an could ask who the last person was, the old Taoist priest had already reached forward and made a grabbing motion, dragging a skinny little girl from the air and smacking her on the back of the head, causing her to faceplant into the post road. The skinny little girl looked up with a blank expression. Qian Ping'an looked at the tall and sturdy old Taoist priest and asked, "Then what about my bridge of immortality?" There was apathy on the old Taoist priest's face as he replied, "The foundation is already complete, so you can investigate this yourself in the future." "What about lasting qi?" Qian Ping'an asked. "I'll naturally return it to Chan Qingdu," the old Taoist priest replied, gazing into the distance. Qian Ping'an placed the 4 picture scrolls inside 15th before cupping his fist and bidding farewell to the old Taoist priest. The old Taoist priest was in a bad mood, so he returned to the lotus flower blessed land with a single stride and took a glance at the neighboring lotus flower world. However, that person had already left the banks of the pond. Only then did the old Taoist priest start to chuckle. Chen Ping'an and the skinny little girl stared at each other. Chen Ping'an sighed and asked, "What's your name?" The skinny little girl wasn't one to be easily flustered. Even though she had no idea what was going on, she still patted the dust from her body and replied with a cheery smile, "Didn't I tell you before? I only have a surname, and my parents didn't manage to give me a name on time. However, I picked a name for myself. It's only a single character, Qian, because I like money." And what's your surname?" Chen Ping'an asked. The skinny little girl stood straight and puffed her chest out as she replied, "Pei, the character with garment on the bottom." 5. I heard my dad say that this is a very big and popular surname in my hometown. There's clothes in my surname and there's money in my name, so just how auspicious is that? Chen Ping'an slapped his forehead. Her surname was Pei and her name was Qian, so her full name was Pei Qian. Pei Qian as in losing money. 6. No wonder he didn't like her. Chen Ping'an was finally able to leave the seemingly endless lotus flower-blessed land. After the old Taoist priest disappeared, the first thing Chen Ping'an did was ask around for the current year in northern Jian Nation. He was truly afraid that, as the book said, 60 years in the mountains would be equivalent to 1,000 years in the mortal world. If he were screwed over by the old Taoist priest and trapped in the lotus flower-blessed land for 10 years or a few dozen years, then it would be very likely that he couldn't even find his enemies to exact revenge on. Not only that, but he had also lost lasting qi. Fortunately, he was able to breathe a sigh of relief after inquiring a merchant on the official road outside northern Jian Nation about this. It had only gone from the 6th year of Guangxi to the 7th. When it was also autumn in Parasol Leaf Continent right now, and the solar term was also similar to that of the lotus flower-blessed land. It was nearing the middle of autumn. Chen Ping'an now had some mental trauma about northern Jian Nation, so he didn't dare to stay here for much longer. He continued to travel north. He had initially wanted to see Peace and Tranquility Mountain from a distance, especially since he had heard much about its reputation since a long time ago. However, he definitely didn't desire to do this anymore. In addition, he didn't exactly have a good relationship with Springtide Palace's Zhou Fei, Bird's Eye View Peak's Lu Feng, the wandering swordsman Feng Qingbai, and the other otherworldly immortals. Thus, all Chen Ping'an wanted to do was find an immortal ferry station and travel back to Eastern Treasured Vile Continent straight away. Even though Old Man Yang had warned him not to return to the small town within 5 years after leaving, that specifically referred to his hometown only. There were still many other places that he could go. For example, he could go to Old Dragon City where Fan was living, Azure Phoenix Nation where Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia had traveled, Water Combing Nation where Sword Saint Song Yuxiao was, Bamboo Scroll Lake where Guqian's master had taken him, the Academy in Great Sui Nation where Li Baoping and the others were studying, and so on. There were many places he could go. In any case, it was best that he left Parasol Leaf Continent as soon as possible. She hadn't understood a single word when Chen Ping'an had asked that merchant for the year number just then. Chen Ping'an nodded in reply. This little deadweight following him around was another reason that he wanted to leave Parasol Leaf Continent as soon as possible. Bringing her around was completely different than traveling together with Lu Tai. Indeed, things would become very troublesome if they encountered vagrant cultivators who were acting as bandits. However, the gloom in Chen Ping'an's mind became even worse when he thought of Lu Tai as well as that man who had sold Tonghulus in the small town. Qi refiners from the mountains could often observe the world through their palms, especially after they became earth immortals. Even though they wouldn't be as all-knowing and omnipresent as the old Taoist priest was in the lotus flower-blessed land, they could still see enough and know enough to make one feel uncomfortable. He definitely needed to ask Cui Chan's grandfather or Wei Bo about this mystical ability when he returned home in the future. He needed to understand the process and details, and he also needed to understand the taboos and restrictions. Is this your hometown? Is this where immortals live? Pei Qian asked. Chen Ping'an couldn't help but chuckle in speechlessness. He then shook his head and replied, "This isn't my hometown, and it isn't an immortal abode either." Seeing that Chen Ping'an wasn't willing to say anything else, Pei Qian didn't dwell on this topic and pose any further questions. She raised her hands and rubbed her eyes. "What's wrong?" Chen Ping'an asked. Pei Qian looked up with a dazzling smile and replied, "I feel very strange, but I can't remember anything at all. I was sweeping the courtyard in Chao Qinglong's house just then, but I felt the wind blow and I suddenly found myself here. Chen Ping'an shot a glance at her. Actually, I finished sweeping the courtyard and I was sitting on my stool eating roasted sunflower seeds. Pei Qian immediately corrected. The two of them walked for just 10 kilometers or so, and Pei Qian was already exhausted and panting like an old cow. Her face was scrunched up in a pitiful manner, and she said that the soles of her feet were already filled with blisters. Chen Ping'an hired a horse-drawn carriage from beside a relay station. After negotiating the price and receiving a satisfactory offer, he paid the money and started to travel north on the carriage. He agreed to stop the carriage at a prefectural city located on the border of northern Jian Nation, 2 days away. Parasol Leaf Continent's northern Jian Nation was completely different from the Lotus Flower Blessed Land's northern Jian Nation. It had enjoyed peace for many years, and everyone was very relaxed and lenient regardless of whether it was officials from the relay stations or officials checking one's passports. In fact, they could stay in relay stations even if they weren't officials, as long as they had enough silver in their pockets. This was Pei Qian's first time traveling in a horse-drawn carriage, and the skinny little girl found this an extremely novel and exciting experience. She felt very relaxed and satisfied as the carriage rocked side to side, and she would occasionally pull back the curtains to peer at the scenery outside. Following the arrival of autumn, one could often see large expanses of dazzling golden persimmon plantations not far from the official road. Pei Qian couldn't help but drool, and she felt a strong urge to have Chen Ping'an ask the carriage driver to stop so that she could run over and grab a bucketful of persimmons. While Pei Qian was peering out the window, Chen Ping'an seized the opportunity to take out the 4 picture scrolls and examine them. The scroll spindles were all different, with one made from insect-proof red sandalwood, one made from white jade, and 2 made from unknown materials. The 4 people in the picture scrolls also appeared vivid and lifelike. Wei Xian, the founding emperor of Southern Garden Nation, was sitting in a manner typical of emperors when they had their portraits painted. He was wearing a golden dragon robe, yet he didn't appear especially tall or sturdy. Rather, he seemed a little short and skinny. Add to that the loose-fitting his dragon robe, and he ended up appearing slightly awkward. Sui Yubian, the female sword immortal who had failed to ascend with her physical body, had a sword on her back and looked dashing and gallant. She was looking into the eyes of the person looking at the picture scroll. Lu Baixiang, the founder of the demonic force, was dressed in a suit of bright red armor. His hands were resting on the hilt of his saber whose tip was digging into the ground, and he appeared more like a mortal emperor than Wei Xian. Zhu Lian, the martial arts maniac who had died at Ding Ying's hands, was hunchbacked, with his hands clasped behind his back. His eyes were squinted, and he appeared much like an old man from the marketplace. These 4 picture scrolls only 8 grain rain coins? The problem was, how many grain rain coins did he need to feed each scroll to have the relevant person walk out and come to life? Moreover, the claim that they would be unquestioningly loyal to him was something that remained to be seen. Taking 10,000 steps back, Chen Ping'an was a pure martial artist who viewed even golden sweet wine, deep infatuation, and halting snow as external matters. Fortunately, the old Taoist priest had taken him on a journey through time and space in the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, allowing him to better understand the world and many mortal matters. The change was subtle and intangible, but Chen Ping'an was now starting to use a different lens to observe the great trend of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent as well as the situation and status of Jewel's small world in relation to the Great Li Empire. His views were no longer so extreme. Otherwise, with his past temperament, Chen Ping'an might have even sold these 4 picture scrolls for an astronomical price. Pei Qian leaned over and craned her neck to look at Sui Yubian's picture scroll. "This big sister is so pretty," she commented in a soft voice. Chen Ping'an ignored her and carefully rolled the 4 picture scrolls up. He didn't place the picture scrolls inside his pocket treasure in front of Pei Qian, and he instead rested them beside his feet. He couldn't help but sigh with emotion in his mind. These 4 ancestors were far too difficult to raise. How could they compare to first and 15th, especially since the 2 flying swords were able to stay inside his sword nurturing gourd? To say nothing of grain rain coins, first and 15th hadn't even required him to spend a single snowflake coin after experiencing so many battles and living together for so long. Chen Ping'an didn't need to worry about refining them or nurturing them either. In reality, Qian Ping'an possessed a dragon-slaying platform, the best kind of whetstone in the world when it came to refining and nurturing flying swords. However, Qian Ping'an naturally wasn't willing to damage the dragon-slaying platform inscribed with the characters innocent and Ningyao a single bit. Fortunately, 1st and 15th had never thrown a tantrum regarding this matter. Even so, Qian Ping'an still planned to buy a small dragon-slaying platform from Sage Ruanqiong when he returned to Dragon Spring Prefecture in the future. He couldn't treat his 2 flying swords too shabbily after all. Qian Ping'an wouldn't skimp on this purchase, even if it meant potentially using gold essence copper coins instead of grain rain coins. He looked at the little girl. Pei Qian also looked at him, with worry gripping at her heart. She was afraid that he would boot her off the carriage with a single kick. She was unfamiliar with this world and the people here, so wouldn't she be bullied to death? Back in the capital of Southern Garden Nation, she was at least familiar with the streets and keenly aware of whom she could steal from, which children she could mug, who she couldn't provoke, whom she needed to ingratiate herself with, and so on. There was a small notebook in her mind, one that helped her navigate the world. However, winter was about to arrive, so she would freeze to death even if she didn't starve to death once heavy snow started to sprinkle down and bury the ground. She had seen many old beggars and young beggars freeze to death after failing to endure through those snowstorms. Their corpses looked very ugly. Pei Qian was aware that Qian Ping'an didn't like her. Just like she was aware that Qian Ping'an liked Chao Qinglang very much. She didn't try to make Qian Ping'an like her either. She would be happy as long as she had enough to eat and drink. In fact, it would be best if he could give her a large pile of silver. As for whether he liked her or not, how much silver was that worth? The carriage driver was an old man familiar with this section of the official road. Qian Ping'an and Pei Qian stayed in a relay station for the night, while the old carriage driver chose to cope inside his carriage. Qian Ping'an asked for 2 of the cheapest rooms, with one neighboring the other. Scared, Qian Ping'an found this slightly humorous. She was courageous enough to climb onto the stone lions of a wealthy family and sleep there for a night, yet surprisingly afraid of sleeping in a dark room. However, Qian Ping'an still allowed her to enter. Pei Qian obediently closed the door behind her, and Qian Ping'an gestured for her to sit down opposite him before saying slowly, "This place is called Parasol Leaf Continent, and it's a very big continent. Our destination is Eastern Treasured Vial Continent, and my hometown is located in the north of this continent. Starting from tomorrow, you'll need to learn the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vial Continent, as well as the dialect of my home nation, the Greatly Empire." There was a beaming smile on Pei Qian's face as she nodded earnestly and replied, "Okie dokie." It wasn't the case that she wanted to learn some bullshit official dialect or whatnot. Rather, this person was implying that he was going to bring her to his hometown. What did this signify? This signified free food, free drink, and free shelter, no? However, what Qian Ping'an said next was like a bucket of cold water being poured over her head. There was a cloudy expression on the skinny little girl's face as she grumbled and complained in her mind. As Qian Ping'an deftly moved his carving knife and continued to inscribe characters on the bamboo slips from Azure Divine Mountain that Wei Bo had given him, his head lowered and his movements meticulous, he said to Pei Qian, "Apart from teaching you the 2 official dialects, I'll also teach you how to read starting from tomorrow. If you study hard and do well, then you'll be able to fill your stomach every meal. If you don't study hard and don't do well, however, then you'll naturally have less to eat." Pei Qian grimaced and said in a pitiful voice, "I'm very dumb." "Oh, then it looks like I can save some money," Qian Ping'an remarked. Pei Qian secretly stole a glance at Qian Ping'an. He didn't look like he was joking, so she immediately smiled and added, "I'll still do my best though." After saying this, she lay down on the table and asked in a quiet voice, "Can you buy me some new clothes?" Qian Ping'an didn't so much as raise his head as he replied, "I'll buy you some thicker clothes when the weather becomes colder." "But it's already autumn, and the weather is already very cold," Pei Qian mumbled. "Also, just look at this, there's already a hole in my shoe. Really, I'm not lying to you. If I get sick, you'll even have to look after me. Just how troublesome would that be?" She raised her foot as she said this, and sure enough, her shoe was indeed broken. Her tan toes were already poking out from the front. Qian Ping'an put his carving knife down and used his fingers to gently brush away the bamboo scraps that were so fine that they were barely visible. "Go back to your room and sleep. We still need to wake up early to continue our journey tomorrow." Pei Qian didn't say anything else, and silently stood up and left, returning to her room next door. A wide smile immediately spread across her face when she closed the door. Yet she immediately wiped this smile from her face and put on a stern expression instead. She didn't allow herself to laugh out loud. She then jumped onto the bed and happily rolled around. In the end, she gazed up at the ceiling and kicked her shoes off. Upon thinking of Chen Ping'an's expression just then, she copied his actions and bluntly said, "Return to your room and sleep." She didn't dare to speak out loud, but she quickly made a face after saying this. Before going to sleep, she jumped off the bed and walked over to light the oil lamp. Only then did she snuggle into bed and sleep until the next morning. It would be a waste if she didn't light the oil lamp. This was how wealthy people should act. 1. Guangxi here refers to the reign title of the emperor. It changes with each emperor, and it is used to record the year number based on how long the emperor has ruled for Dai in the room next door. Chen Ping'an used 3 entire bamboo slips to complete his travel journal pertaining to his experiences in the lotus flower-blessed land. The characters on the bamboo slip were small and densely packed together. After putting out the oil lamp, he started to practice the 6-step walking meditation combined with various sword techniques from the proper sword scripture. However, he only feigned holding a sword like always. His movements were silent, and he was like a fish freely swimming through water as he completely hid his fist intent and aura. This was starkly different from that time in the past when he had practiced fist techniques beside Dragon Whisker River, with fist intent coursing through his entire body. Right now, Chen Ping'an was entirely capable of multitasking and thinking about other matters as he practiced his fist techniques. Following on from walking meditation and standing meditation, the mountain shaking guide also detailed the process of sleeping meditation eternity. Chen Ping'an had already understood the principles and fist stances of this meditation technique a long time ago, and after reaching the 4th tier, he had already felt like it would be quite easy to perform. However, what held him back was the fact that the essence of sleeping meditation was intimately tied to the notion of slumbering as if dead. Entering this state would cause one's soul to become completely still and seemingly lifeless. At the same time, one's soul would be allowed to thoroughly rest and recuperate. Chen Ping'an had embarked on 2 long journeys, traveling further and further each time. Thus he hadn't dared to sleep too soundly. As a result, he was forced to delay his cultivation of sleeping meditation again and again. He could only investigate it once he returned to Dragon Spring Prefecture. In any case, he had been tossed out of the lotus flower-blessed land far too suddenly. Otherwise, Chen Ping'an would have definitely done his best to gather the top-notch martial arts techniques of the blessed land. Thinking back, Ding Ying's martial arts path hadn't actually been wrong. He had genuinely stood on the tallest summit of the mountains, and he could have genuinely been regarded as the peak of martial arts. To reach such a level, one needed to not only comprehend one's own Tao, but also to observe the scenery of those shorter mountains. One needed to validate their comprehension and make up for any shortcomings. Only then could one transform their comprehension into fist intent, and only at that moment would their fist intent become loftier than the heavens. Though the approach of building bridges according to those books from the Ministry of Works was different, the end result was strikingly similar. Before Chen Ping'an knew it, the first light of dawn was already starting to peek through his window. Chen Ping'an wouldn't sweat even if he practiced fist techniques for an entire night now. This was perhaps the benefit brought about by his strengthened soul after he advanced to the 5th tier. However, when he wore golden sweet wine, it wouldn't make a difference whether he perspired or not. While Chen Ping'an was practicing fist techniques, the little lotus spirit, who had already made a full recovery, sat on the corner of the table and dozed off. After leaving the lotus flower-blessed land, it seemed like there was something weighing on the little lotus spirit's mind. Chen Ping'an finished his training session and sat beside the table, looking at the drooping head of the little lotus spirit. Chen Ping'an smiled and stroked its head, not saying anything and not trying to console it. In reality, Chen Ping'an wasn't especially good at consoling others. He took out the 4 picture scrolls once again, unfurling them on the table and contemplating whether he should take this gamble. In the past, Chen Ping'an had always feared the notion of fortune as if it were a ferocious beast. Now, however, the knot in his heart had already been largely untied. After the collapse of Jewel's small world, he had fallen victim to Branch Master Lu Chen's schemes one time. causing his fortune to become linked with divine edict sex He Xiaoyang. Afterward, his fortunes had turned during his trip to Great Sui Nation, and he had become incredibly lucky instead. Following his encounter with He Xiaoyang on the Kuan ship, his fortune had still remained fairly good. In addition, Chen Ping'an was no longer poor like before. To say nothing of the huge benefits he had reaped during his trip with Lu Tai, even the Yin god who had accompanied Zheng Dafeng in Old Dragon City had spent a whopping 10 grain rain coins to purchase a small bamboo slip made from courage bamboo from him. It was as if he had simply wanted to purchase the characters engraved on the bamboo slip. Gods and immortals walk two different paths separated by yin and yang. The soul consolidates the psyche, while the spirit gives rise to the godly body. Due to all of his experiences, Chen Ping'an didn't have the extravagant hope of raising all 4 picture scrolls and bringing all 4 people to life. Instead, he would pick a single picture scroll to focus on. This could be described as making a small gamble to entertain himself. He was playing within his limits. Chaos was already budding, so Chen Ping'an indeed needed some helpers to assist with guarding his home and managing his property. Chen Ping'an didn't dare to rely on Cui Chan's grandfather. One simply taught fist techniques and one simply learned fist techniques. He didn't dare to ask for anything extra. Wei Bo was the formal god of the Great Li Empire's northern mountain, after all, so he naturally had his own duties to attend to. The Tao foundation of the little boy in azure and the little girl in pink was still shallow, and Chen Ping'an treated them more as little siblings than his followers. This was due to his personality and feelings, and it had nothing to do with their age. If they genuinely encountered some serious situation, not only would Chen Ping'an prevent them from facing danger, but he would even ask them to go far away from the conflicts and schemes. However, Chen Ping'an didn't feel this kind of burden and responsibility toward the 4 people in the picture scrolls. As for how they would get along and how the situation would change after they became familiar with each other, that was a question best left to the future. Chen Ping'an didn't know which of the 4 picture scrolls to pick first. However, he was extremely clear about which one he shouldn't pick first, the picture scroll with Sui Yubian. After all, just what would happen if Ningyao found out that a woman had walked out from a picture scroll and was following him around? Not only that, but he would have even spent a small fortune of grain rain coins on her. Thus, Chen Ping'an quickly rolled up Sui Yubian's picture scroll and placed it inside 15th. Afterward, he put away the picture scroll with Lu Baixiang, the founder of the demonic force, as well. He looked like an unruly person, which made sense considering he had created the largest and most powerful demonic force in the Lotus Flower blessed land. After Chen Ping'an spent a huge amount of money and time to bring him out of the picture scroll, what would he do if Lu Baixiang was an incredibly ambitious yet immoral person like Springtide Palace's Zhou Fei? What if Lu Baixiang was someone who flouted social rules and engaged in treasonous acts? Would Chen Ping'an suppress him and toss him back into the picture scroll? It made absolutely no sense for Chen Ping'an to take such a huge gamble and spend his money in such an unreasonable manner. Grain rain coins weren't snowflake coins after all. In fact, even snowflake coins couldn't be wasted in such an unreasonable manner. After putting the second picture scroll away, only 2 picture scrolls remained on the table. The picture with Wei Xian, the old ancestor of Wei Liang, and the picture scroll of martial arts maniac Zhu Lian, someone who looked surprisingly amiable on the surface. Zhu Lian was once the owner of the silver-colored lotus flower hat, and this caused Chen Ping'an to feel a slight sense of apprehension and alertness. He had almost been killed by Ding Ying during their battle in Bull Mountain, and that had undoubtedly been the most ferocious and deadly battle in Chen Ping'an's life. Chen Ping'an was extremely hesitant as he stared at the 2 picture scrolls. The little lotus spirit quietly sat beside Chen Ping'an, also appearing extremely earnest as it examined the 2 picture scrolls. Chen Ping'an couldn't decide, so he smiled at the little lotus spirit and asked, "Which one looks better to you?" The little lotus spirit turned around, and the little guy who only had a single arm pointed at the picture scrolls before pointing at itself, seemingly asking Chen Ping'an whether he genuinely wanted it to make the choice for him. Chen Ping'an nodded with a wide smile. The little lotus spirit quickly stood up and started to run around the perimeters of the 2 picture scrolls with its eyes wide open. From time to time, it would even lay down on the table to carefully observe the 2 people in the picture scrolls. It looked extremely earnest and adorable. Chen Ping'an chuckled in delight. In the end, the little lotus spirit squatted on the table and pointed at the picture scroll beside it, the one that contained Wei Xian. "Alrighty, then we'll pick him," Qin Ping'an said with a laugh. The little lotus spirit stood up and quickly ran to the edge of the table, tugging at Qin Ping'an's sleeve and seemingly worried that it might have made the wrong choice. "It's alright. A choice had to be made, so it doesn't matter even if we made the wrong choice." Qin Ping'an extended a finger and tickled the little lotus spirit's armpits, causing it to giggle out loud. He then retrieved a grain rain coin and held it between two fingers, gently placing it on the picture scroll that contained Wei Xian, the founding emperor of Southern Garden Nation. The grain rain coin immediately disintegrated like melting snow when it came into contact with the picture scroll, and a layer of spiritual energy unique to grain rain coins quickly spread across the picture scroll's surface. This spiritual energy was misty like the water vapor rising above lakes, yet it suddenly dispersed at some moment, bringing an extra hint of vitality to Wei Xian's portrait when Qin Ping'an looked at it again. This was especially the case with his intricate and luxurious dragon robe, which was shimmering with a golden glow. However, it was a shame that nothing else changed. It was still a complete mystery how many grain rain coins he needed to feed these picture scrolls to bring the four people back to life. Qin Ping'an decided that he would stop at 10 grain rain coins. If there was still no sign of success, then he would swallow his loss and treat this as a failed gamble. He carefully put the picture scroll away before wearing deep infatuation and halting Snow by his hips. After slinging his cotton luggage sack over his shoulders, he left his room and went next door to call Pei Qian. It was time to set off again. After knocking for a long time, the skinny little girl finally trundled over in a dawdling manner and opened the door with sleepy eyes. She felt slightly reluctant to pack up and leave when she saw that it was Qin Ping'an. She finished getting ready and started to walk out, yet Qin Ping'an looked at her and pointed at the bed. Pei Qian was completely baffled. "Make the bed before you leave," Qin Ping'an said. "But we paid to stay in this relay station. You spent a lot of silver to stay here," Pei Qian said in an aggrieved voice. Qin Ping'an remained silent. Pei Qian had no option but to return and make the bed. Qin Ping'an frowned when he saw the oil lamp on the table. Afterward, the carriage driver, extremely familiar with this route, would often organize each section of the trip perfectly such that his two customers would be able to stay at relay stations and town inns when night eventually fell. They didn't have any opportunity to camp out in the wilderness. Qin Ping'an started to teach her the two official dialects as well as the local customs and cultures of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent and the Great Li Empire. In addition, he retrieved a Confucian classic that he had bought from champion scholar Ali, and used it to teach her characters. That way she could study, learn characters, and learn the two official dialects at the same time. This was hitting 3 birds with 1 stone. However, Pei Qian didn't pay much attention to these lessons. Even so, she could already recognize 100 or so characters. She clearly disliked reading, and she was obviously more fond of sleeping in the carriage. If there was nothing to do and if Qin Ping'an didn't stop her, she could sleep in the carriage for more than half a day at a time. When she woke up, she would pull the curtain back to enjoy the scenery for a while. When she had enough, she would lay back down and go to sleep again. This was quite impressive. The latter half of their journey was plagued by rain. Slowly but surely, the horse-drawn carriage eventually arrived at a border prefectural city of northern Jian Nation. After paying the remaining half of the carriage hire fee, Qin Ping'an and Pei Qian started to travel on foot. The weather was becoming colder and rain was falling more often, so Qin Ping'an eventually decided to buy Pei Qian new boots and a new set of thicker clothes. However, he didn't give it to her straight away, so Pei Qian could only stare at his bulging luggage sack with wide eyes as they walked. In fact, she even went as far as to offer to carry the luggage sack for Qin Ping'an. The city gates and checkpoints inside Northern Jian Nation weren't especially strict, and as long as one forged a decent relationship with the carriage drivers, one could easily enter the cities even if they didn't hold any passports or travel documents. It was through this way that Pei Qian entered and exited many cities. However, the border was different, so Qin Ping'an started to take her over mountains and across rivers. This exposed her complete lack of ability to endure hardships. The gulf between her and Li Baoping was like the gulf between heaven and earth. Even though Qin Ping'an was carefully adjusting his speed and travel distance to cater to her skinny legs, Pei Qian still moaned in pain and tried her best to squeeze tears from her eyes. No matter how good-tempered Qian Pingyan was, he still eventually became tired of her antics. After receiving her new boots and clothes, Pei Qian's behavior improved for the following few days. However, she didn't know how to cherish her belongings, so it wasn't long before her clothes were damaged in many places by the thorns and branches along the sides of the narrow paths. Her behavior gradually deteriorated again, and she only recovered some spirit and energy after Qian Pingyan agreed to buy her a new set of clothes once they arrived in the next town. The border of northern Jin nation was extremely long, and the mountain paths that ran along it were also very difficult to traverse. Pei Qian's expression remained sullen from morning until night, and she would purposely write in wriggly and worm-like strokes whenever Qian Pingyan asked her to write characters on the ground using nearby branches. If Qian Pingyan told her to write 100 characters, then she would write exactly 100 characters and not a single stroke more. During this time, Qian Pingyan fed Wei Xian's picture scroll another 3 grain rain coins. Walking was essentially the same as practicing fist techniques for Qian Pingyan, and each inhale and exhale that he performed would be an act of tempering his physique. He didn't need to explicitly practice walking meditation because of this, so it appeared as if he were focusing all of his attention on practicing standing meditation instead. Only when Qian Pingyan practiced standing meditation would Pei Qian feel a sense of motivation. She didn't dare to approach Qian Pingyan, but she would stand in the distance and silently watch him stand there like a block of inanimate wood. As time went on, however, Pei Qian eventually grew bored of this as well. On this night, Qian Pingyan and Pei Qian set up camp in the wilderness. Apart from buying Pei Qian a small tent made from cowhide in some border prefectural city, Qian Pingyan had also bought himself some fishing hooks and fishing lines. After crafting a fishing rod from some thin bamboo that he found in the mountains, Qian Pingyan sat beside a small stream and started to fish. It was late at night, yet Qian Pingyan suddenly turned around only to see flashes of red in the distant forest. It wasn't long before he saw a strange scene. A grand sedan chair with a large red lantern hanging at each corner was being carried by 8 individuals, all apparently beasts or spirits who had grown up in these mountains. Meanwhile, those beating the drums and striking the gongs were a group of entities and ghosts. Leading the procession was a skeleton with a rusty sword by its hip. Beside the grand sedan chair, there also stood an old woman who was wearing bright makeup and dressed in festive red clothes. Her makeup was extremely thick, and the red blusher on her cheeks contrasted strongly with the rest of her deathly pale face. Not only that, but there was also a streak of black smoke lingering around her body. Qian Pingyan was familiar with all kinds of immortal and spiritual matters now, so he understood that this was most likely a so-called marriage ceremony for some mountain god. He wasn't willing to attract unnecessary trouble, so he pretended that he didn't see anything at all. Unexpectedly, however, Pei Qian woke up at this exact moment. She crawled out of her small tent and rubbed her eyes as she dazedly started at the wedding procession in the distance. Qian Pingyan put his fishing rod down and walked to Pei Qian's side. The old woman in the distance looked over, a smile on her face as she gazed at the skinny little girl. She appeared amused, and she raised a thin arm and commanded the grand sedan chair beside her to come to a halt. Including the skeletal sword practitioner, all of the beasts, spirits, entities and ghosts in the wedding procession looked over in unison. This was an extremely eerie scene. Qian Pingyan cupped his fists in respect and actively apologized to the wedding procession in the distance. Everyone followed their own rules and customs, and there was an especially clear difference between yin entities and yang entities. The world had its own natural order. Take the current situation, for example. If Pei Qian hadn't broken a taboo by brazenly staring at the wedding procession, then those spirits and other beings wouldn't have cared about her and Qian Pingyan's presence at all. They would have continued on their merry way just like that. This was also the reason why many woodsmen and fishermen in the world were able to avoid disaster even though they lived near the mountains and waters for generation after generation. The old woman nodded in acknowledgement upon seeing Qian Pingyan's tactful apology, and she waved her hand and continued to march forward with the wedding procession. The sound of drums and gongs rang out once again as the beasts, spirits, entities and ghosts continued to march toward the bridegroom, the mountain god. Pei Qian almost caused huge trouble this time. Yet Qian Pingyan didn't blame the skinny little girl for her actions. She wasn't a cultivator, so she was naturally unaware of the rules of the cultivation world. As such, her actions could be forgiven. Moreover, this all came down to Qian Ping'an failing to teach her properly, so it would make little sense to blame Pei Qian for his mistake. However, it would be a completely different matter if Pei Qian kept doing the same things even after Qian Ping'an taught her the rules of the cultivation world. Pei Qian's little face was deathly pale as she nodded and replied, I woke up and walked out because I heard the commotion. I thought it was all a dream. It was far too terrifying. Qian Ping'an extended a finger and gently placed it on Pei Qian's glabella, helping to calm her mind and soul. If a mortal were to accidentally come across such entities, their soul might be extremely susceptible to swaying in unease if their yang energy wasn't strong enough. This would be the case even if the mortal couldn't see the entities, and even if the entities had no intention of harming the mortal. This would silently and formlessly damage the foundation of one's vitality, and many scary tales of people being haunted by ghosts or possessed by evil spirits, leading to extreme sickness originated from these types of encounters. Thankfully, Pei Qian didn't experience any such symptoms. Qian Ping'an looked at her and warned her, I'm not sure how you were able to see them, but remember to completely ignore these beings if you encounter them again in the future. Otherwise, your actions will be viewed as provocation, and there's a big risk that you'll bring trouble onto yourself. We were fortunate that tonight's wedding procession consisted of beings who leaned more toward the orthodox and reasonable side of things. Perhaps their statuses are similar to those of officials in the yang world, and it's because of this that they let us off the hook. There was lingering fear in Pei Qian's mind as she nodded with all her might. Have you ever seen lone spirits or wandering ghosts inside or outside the capital of Southern Garden Nation these past few years? Qian Ping'an asked. Pei Qian earnestly shook her head with a sullen expression, replying, I've never seen these kinds of filthy things before. Not a single time. Qian Ping'an nodded with a contemplative expression and warned, when traveling outside and traversing over mountains and across rivers, you shouldn't be so reckless as to label them as filthy things. Oh, okay, I'll remember that, Pei Qian replied. Qian Ping'an sighed. Everything's okay now, you can go back to sleep. You'll be safe with me keeping watch. However, how could Pei Qian dare to go back to sleep after such a terrifying experience? She insisted on following Qian Ping'an to the small stream, and was finally on her best behavior now. She appeared sickly and listless, and didn't even dare to ask for new clothes and new boots anymore. She felt like being able to travel with Qian Ping'an, and have a full belly guaranteed was the greatest blessing in the world. Qian Ping'an picked up his fishing rod, while Pei Qian grabbed a rock and used it to randomly scrawl on the ground. Once bitten, twice shy. She didn't even dare to raise her head and look around at this moment, and she always had a nagging feeling that those horrifying beings were still hiding around every corner. Is this the meaning of the phrase, one should not look at that which is contrary to propriety, and one should not listen to that which is contrary to propriety, in the book that you gave me? Pei Qian asked. Qian Ping'an couldn't help but chuckle. By the looks of it, she would only learn when she was made to suffer. Even though this sagely teaching wasn't exactly applicable in this context, Qian Ping'an was ultimately unwilling to reject the results of her contemplation, saying, the underlying principles of this teaching are extremely vast and profound. Your understanding isn't necessarily wrong, but it's still far from being able to completely grasp these words. However, the more you read and learn in the future, the more you'll naturally gain a deeper understanding of these teachings. Pei Qian felt like the only way to suppress the fear in her heart was to chat more with Qian Ping'an, so she randomly asked, then why do the books also teach us not to comment on peculiar matters, immense strength, chaotic events, and ghosts and deities? 1. Qian Ping'an smiled faintly and replied, once you read enough, you'll naturally understand whether I'm wrong or whether this sagely principle is wrong. Pei Qian was quite unhappy with this answer, so she fell silent with a sullen expression. After a long time, she finally squeezed out another question, asking, are you unable to beat them? Qian Ping'an couldn't help but chuckle. We were the ones in the wrong, so what does this have to do with whether I can beat them or not? Pei Qian looked up with a bright glimmer in her eyes and replied, if you could beat them, then you wouldn't have needed to lower your head and apologize to them. Rather, they would have needed to apologize to us and take a detour. After all, their drums and gongs are so loud and annoying, so it's only right that they apologize to us. It would be even better if they could compensate us with some money. And so what if I can beat them? What does that have to do with you? Qian Ping'an asked. Pei Qian faltered upon hearing this. She then forced a smile and said, "Because we're travel companions." Chen Pingan's gaze remained fixed on the small stream and his fishing line the entire time, and it was as if he were speaking to himself as he remarked, "The notions of right and wrong don't differentiate between relatives, friends, and strangers." From the beginning to the end, he never gave a clear answer on whether he could beat those spirits, ghosts, and other beings from the local mountains and rivers. He was afraid that Pei Qian would lose the sense of fear in her heart once she learned of the truth. At that time she would very likely become careless and tactless again. As for the mountain god sitting at home and waiting for his bride to arrive, Chen Pingan was roughly aware of his cultivation base. No matter if it was the county magistrate of mortal counties or the city god of the city god temples who attended to matters of the Yin world, these officials and deities would all have attendants and guards of honor when they went out to patrol their jurisdictions. Among the guards of honor, there were traditionally some who struck gongs to clear the path. If one was of a higher rank, then the gongs would also be struck harder and louder. This was a wedding procession, however, so the unceasing sound of drums and gongs was far more joyful and celebratory than usual. The ghost attendants weren't ordered to carry wooden signs with the instructions of silence, stand back, and that most impressive and eye-catching official title sign either. However, there were still official customs that needed to be followed, so it was dictated that the gongs needed to be struck 9 times in a row every so often. This was to warn others to stand back and open up a path. This was most likely a result of that mountain god wanting face as well. He was potentially showing off to the spirits and ghosts in the neighboring jurisdictions. Judging from this, one could conclude that this person had become a mountain god with the official position of commandery governor after his death. Apart from having a mountain god temple and a clay statue godly body, he also had the right to construct his own official residence. As such, he could be regarded as a high-ranking provincial officer in the regional areas. This would be the case in both Eastern Treasured Vial Continent and Parasol Leaf Continent. Indeed, this mountain god's standing was similar to that of the little boy in Azure's good brother, the river god of the Imperial River. Thus, his cultivation base was at least equivalent to that of 6th-tier Qi refiners. In fact, it might even rival that of 7th-tier Dragon Gate-tier Qi refiners. As for whether Chen Pingan could defeat him, the answer to this was very simple. Eugenie had advanced to the Dragon Gate tier in the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, that place with sparse spiritual energy. Why was Chen Pingan willing to take a gamble with those 4 picture scrolls? Apart from holding the martial arts cultivation bases of founding Emperor Wei Xian, martial arts maniac Zhu Lian, sword immortal Sui Yubian, and demonic force founder Liu Baixiang in high regard, he also greatly valued their cultivation aptitude. Actually, Springtide Palace's Zhou Fei had made clear remarks for a related case. He had stated that Zhongqiu, the imperial preceptor of Southern Garden Nation, had a chance to advance to the 9th tier of martial arts in 30 to 40 years. What was the true identity of Zhou Fei? Not only was he the clan leader of Jade Tablet Sect's Zhang clan, but he was also a powerful Qi refiner at the 11th tier, the unpolished Jade tier. As such, his judgment was naturally very sound. However, the phrase "a chance to" was far from implying certainty. After all, the path of martial Dao wasn't a smooth and straightforward one. Rather, it was a path riddled with dangers, a path where one might die at any moment. Even so, Chen Pingan had already decided from the beginning that he would invest 10 grain rain coins in each of the 4 picture scrolls. He would use this immortal currency to purchase precisely such a chance. In his eyes, it was well worth the price. Pei Qian didn't understand what was so interesting about fishing. They sat there for a long time without any reward, so she started to make conversation to stave off boredom, asking, "Do you frequently see these kinds of strange and peculiar beings in your hometown? Then won't it be incredibly dangerous for people like me? I definitely won't stray too far from you in the future." Chen Pingan focused his attention on fishing. This was also a form of cultivation. When the fish lightly nibbled at the bait, they would cause the fishing line to quiver slightly regardless of whether they were big fish or small fish. Upon feeling this sensation travel through the fishing rod to one's palm, one could then yank the fishing rod backward and drag the baited fish out of the water. In reality, there was no fundamental difference between this and the astral energy of martial artists. The only difference was their strength. Everything came down to skill, experience, and attention to detail. Moreover, Qian Ping'an had purposely chosen a thin length of bamboo to construct his fishing rod. This posed no issue when fishing in streams and ponds, but it would certainly pose huge issues when fishing in large lakes and rivers. When reeling in large fish that weighed upward of 4 kilograms, it would be extremely easy to snap the fishing line by accident if one allowed their attention to waver for even a brief moment. In fact, even the fishing rod might end up snapping. This was very similar to his job of molding pottery and firing pottery in the past as well. Qian Ping'an liked this familiar feeling. Even though he ignored Pei Qian, Qian Ping'an involuntarily recalled his past and discovered that he wasn't so dissimilar to the skinny little girl after some careful contemplation. While living in Clay Vase Alley, while dazedly and naively living in Jewel's small world, Qian Ping'an had faced many dangers just like Pei Qian had experienced in the capital of Southern Garden Nation. Not the dangers of strange beasts or immortal cultivators, but rather starvation and cold. A few missed meals or falling sick from the biting winter cold could have easily spelled their doom. Afterward, he had left Jewel's small world just like she had left the lotus flower-blessed land. They had entered a larger and much more fascinating world. However, an increasing number of unimaginable dangers continued to hurtle their way. The howling wind roared louder, and the thundering rain fell harder. It was as if people were extremely fragile beings who could die at any moment. The two of them were facing a strikingly similar situation. However, their way of dealing with this situation couldn't be more different. Pei Qian failed to grasp the concept of cherishing her fortune. Whenever she obtained some copper coins, she would immediately become profligate and spend all of them in a single go. Meanwhile, Qian Ping'an would carefully cherish each modicum of wealth that he had accumulated through his hard work. Pei Qian had a tendency to abandon the old for the new, and she would never feel a nostalgic attachment to her clothes or boots once they became worn. Instead, she would dream about a set of new clothes falling from the heavens. Indeed, she never felt embarrassed to accept charity from others. Not only that, but she would even beg for charity and help from others. She would never appreciate or feel gratitude toward her benefactors either. In stark contrast, Qian Ping'an was still yet to forget each sliver of compassion and help that he had received in Clay Vase Alley. Everything was clearly recorded in the notebook in his mind. When it came to repaying this compassion and help, he would be extremely careful and restrained, always mindful that giving too much might sometimes lead to disaster. He did everything he could to avoid affecting the fortunes of his benefactors in a detrimental manner. Pei Qian was lazy, unambitious, fond of lying, and convinced that everything she did was correct because it was for the sake of survival. When it came to the difficult question of staying alive, Pei Qian always chose the option that appeared the easiest on the surface. Naturally, stepping back and taking a long-term view was never easy at all. Looking into the depths of Pei Qian's heart, it was clear that she was filled with animosity toward anything that was beautiful and good. If she couldn't obtain something, then she would rather destroy it than leave to someone else. Toward this world that treated her with spite and malice, Pei Qian returned the favor with interest, treating the world with her greatest hostility and viciousness. She was extremely skilled at reading people, and could astutely determine the goodwill or ill intent of other people. However, what did she make of this rare blessing from the heavens? She used it to bully those who were even weaker than her, and she used it to act obsequiously and ingratiate herself with those who were stronger than her. Thus, Qian Ping'an, a kind young man who seldom detested anyone, genuinely detested Pei Qian. However, now that he was interacting with her day and night, he started to observe her actions and use them as a mirror to look back at himself. In the lotus flower-blessed land, Zhongqiu was always worried that Eugenie would end up becoming the type of person that he detested the most, those wanton otherworldly immortals who treated human life with disgusting disregard. Lu Tai had once said, "One can't understand good if one doesn't interact with evil." Qian Ping'an naturally hadn't been willing to keep Pei Qian by his side. However, the old Taoist priest had forcefully dragged her out of the lotus flower-blessed land and taken the choice away from Qian Ping'an. If Qian Ping'an were given a choice, then he would have been more willing to bring Chao Qinglang out of the lotus flower-blessed land. If Zhongqiu were willing to set aside his responsibilities, then Qian Ping'an would have also been willing to bring him to Majestic World so he could witness the sceneries of this vast world. He definitely wouldn't have chosen Wei Xian, Zhu Lian, or the others. The environment couldn't be changed and Pei Qian's situation was already set in stone, Yet she was still unwilling to put in any effort when it came to reading, learning characters, and picking up the new dialects, things that were all essential for survival. Chen Ping'an could barely fathom what would happen if Pei Qian were to swap positions with him. Would she detest Song Jisun and feel extremely jealous of him, yet still get along with this wealthy neighbor on the surface? Would she watch on idly as Lu Xianying was beaten to death? Would she bully Gu Qian for fun every day? Would she follow along with the others in the dragon kiln and stoop to the lowest of levels to torment that feminine man? Would she ingratiate herself with Mr. Qi Aoyang and the scholarly sage? However, even if such a Chen Ping'an were fortunate enough to encounter them in the long river of time, his encounters with them would assuredly be nothing more than fleeting encounters. He would brush past them yet fail to grab the life-changing opportunities with both hands. Old Man Yao had been very correct. All kinds of good karma and fated opportunities existed in the world, yet the question was whether one could grab these things with both hands. If even the small opportunities leak through the gaps between one's fingers, then how could one possibly grow strong enough to fight for and catch the bigger opportunities? However, there was another but. He could remember his parents' kind-heartedness and the few words that Old Man Yao had spoken afterward. But what about Pei Qian? It seemed as if no one had ever taught her how to differentiate between right and wrong. Chen Ping'an had already taught her for quite a while now, yet she was still as ungrateful and misbehaved as usual. Perhaps this was a case of a leopard not being able to change its spots? Chen Ping'an felt a little frustrated. He had accompanied Li Baoping, Li Huai, and Lin Shui to Great Sui Nation, and Cui Dongshan, Yu Lu, and Xie Xie had joined them partway through their long trip. However, Chen Ping'an had never felt as frustrated as he was feeling now. Chen Ping'an put his fishing rod away. Pei Qian rested her cheeks in her hands and asked, "Why aren't you fishing anymore? You still haven't caught anything yet. Fish soup is very good, and dried fish is also delicious." Chen Ping'an wanted to say something, but couldn't help but hesitate. In the end, he chose to swallow his words and remain silent. He had initially wanted to be forthright with her. For example, he would say that if Chao Qinglang were here instead of her, then he would happily teach the little boy fist techniques as long as he was willing to learn. He would also be happy to teach the little boy sword techniques. In fact, even if Chao Qinglang wanted to become a qi refiner, Chen Ping'an would still be willing to help him and provide him with all the grain rain coins and immortal treasures that he needed. However, his attitude toward Pei Qian was different. Even if she had cultivation talent, Chen Ping'an would still be unwilling to teach her anything. In fact, he wasn't even willing to let her take an extra glance at the six-step walking meditation of the mountain shaking guide. Chen Ping'an recalled the first time that Aoyang had appeared. He recalled the section of the trip that they had completed together. Had Aoyang also viewed him? Had Aoyang viewed him like he was viewing Pei Qian now? Or had Aoyang viewed him like he had viewed Chao Qinglang back in the small courtyard? "Do you want to learn how to fish?" Chen Ping'an suddenly asked. "Can I not learn? I also have to memorize books and practice handwriting every day. So I'm afraid that I won't be able to learn so many things at once," Pei Qian replied in a quiet voice. Chen Ping'an smiled and said, "You don't have to learn it if you don't want to. You should go back to bed now. If everything goes smoothly, that wedding procession should pass by again in a moment, bringing the bride to visit the commandery governor. Remember to pretend that you're asleep. From tomorrow onward, you'll also be responsible for looking after the luggage and the fishing rod." Upon recalling those filthy beings from just then, Pei Qian didn't dare to refuse Chen Ping'an's request. She hesitantly returned to her small tent, and she tossed and turned for a long time before finally falling into a light sleep. Chen Ping'an thought for a moment, and eventually walked over to her tent and secretly stuck a mind-calming talisman outside. Roughly 2 hours later, the wedding procession which had gone to pick up the bride with a grand sedan chair returned even more lively and boisterous than before. At the same time, many spirits and beasts from the bride's territory were following behind the wedding procession. Some could already assume human form, yet some were still traversing the mountains in their true form. Among these spirits and beasts, there was a pitch-black spider as large as a millstone, 2 muscular apes that dashed forward in a swift and nimble manner, and a female ghost whose face was caked in blood whose lower garment was actually burial garment. Many of the spirits and beasts were itching to cause trouble when they saw Chen Ping'an sitting by the small stream and reading a book. However, They were forced to restrain themselves as there were many ghost attendants watching over them and keeping them under control. Chen Ping'an suddenly stood up. There was a maidservant wearing a red dress and holding a lantern in the distance, and her feet didn't make contact with the ground as she hovered toward Chen Ping'an. She curtsied in greeting before smiling and asking in a gentle voice, "Esteemed traveler, today is a joyous day for the commandery governor, and I was just asked to extend an invitation to you. Are you interested in attending tonight's wedding banquet? Please rest assured, esteemed traveler. The commandery governor is known for his fairness and upright nature, so not only will your young energy and lifespan not be detrimentally affected if you attend, but you'll even receive a small present instead." Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied with a smile, "I truly don't dare to disturb the esteemed commandery governor. Please extend my thanks for the warm invitation." The maidservant wasn't angry at Chen Ping'an's blunt refusal to attend, and she smiled in a graceful and restrained manner and said, "Then this servant will wish you a safe and smooth journey. If you encounter any challenges within a 400-kilometer radius, then feel free to use the name of the commandery governor, Jin Huang. This will guarantee you a safe passage." Chen Ping'an cupped his fists and thanked the maidservant, saying, "Please offer my congratulations to the commandery governor." The maidservant smiled beautifully before turning around to leave in a graceful manner, leaving a refreshing fragrance in her wake. When the old woman heard from the maidservant that Chen Ping'an wasn't willing to attend the wedding banquet, she simply dismissed his response with a smile. It was a shame that the young boy was going to let slip a huge fated opportunity. The mountain god was renowned for his generosity, and those who attended his wedding banquet tonight would all be offered a cup of orchid wine and a small section of 1,000-year-old ginseng. Others were all racking their brains and doing everything they could to attend this wedding banquet. Yet this young boy was actually doing the opposite and failing to cherish this opportunity? Then so be it. She wouldn't place a blade on his neck and force him to accept the fated opportunities. An arm that was as white as a lotus root pulled back the exquisitely embroidered curtain of the grand sedan chair, revealing a woman wearing a phoenix headdress and a red face cover. Her appearance was concealed, and she looked at the old woman through her red face cover. The old woman bowed and asked with a faint smile, "Is something the matter, young mistress? How much longer until we stop and enter the residence?" the bride asked in a mellow voice. She was an ordinary woman from a highly educated clan, and it was love at first sight when she had encountered the mountain god by chance several years ago during one of his patrols to the prefectural city. However, getting married to a mountain god with her young body would have detrimentally affected her hidden virtue, as well as the mountain god's merit and virtue. Even so, she was still deeply in love with the mountain god. Thus, after dutifully attending to her parents for 3 years, she had constructed a path to fortune and prosperity for her clan with the secret help of the mountain god, the commandery governor of the area. Afterward, she had resolutely cut her wrists and committed suicide. After passing away, it was then perfectly justifiable for her to marry Jin Huang as a yin entity. This adhered to etiquette. Indeed, her deeds had already become a touching story praised by everyone. A splendid residence was located in a mountain pass, and it remained brightly lit and boisterous as the wedding banquet lasted through the night and well into the next day. The mountain god was dressed in a long golden robe, appearing dignified and mighty as he sat in the seat of the host. Meanwhile, his newlywed wife leaned against him in a loving manner. The skeletal sword practitioner seemed to enjoy a very lofty status in the mountain god's residence. However, it was a shame that it was nothing more than bones, so it naturally couldn't feast on any food or wine. It simply stood beside a tall pillar in the great hall the entire time. While enjoying some beautiful wine, the mountain god glanced up at the sky before secretly giving a look to the skeletal sword practitioner. The latter nodded in acknowledgement and left the great hall. The mighty mountain god then chuckled coldly and announced, "The wedding wine has already been served and enjoyed, so it's now time for the punishment wine to be served and drunk. I've always treated my friends with generosity and kindness, yet many among you actually dared to join forces with some lowly water demons and illegal temples, yearning to attack my residence. Do you truly think that I'm oblivious to all of this?" The large doors of the great hall slammed shut with a boom. The mountain god turned around and smiled warmly at his wife, patting the back of her ice-cold hand and comforting her. "Don't be scared." He smiled apologetically before sighing with emotion. It's my fault for treating you so shabbily this time. To have our wedding reduced to this kind of rabble. Sigh. The woman wasn't afraid of her mountain god husband and she teased. Perhaps you want me to marry you again? Just remember to treat me better in the next 100 and next 1,000 years. Apart from the skeletal sword practitioner leading a group of elites from the mountain god's residence, another group of elites were also resting and waiting to jump into action in someplace else. The majority of them were surprisingly chi refiners. The two groups of elites converged, and before leaving the mountain god's residence that was still enjoying song and wine just then, they cut off and massacred the small army attempting to charge into the mountain god's residence at dawn. At the same time, many officials and ghost attendants who had seemingly been drunk and incapacitated in the great hall immediately sat up straight, their gazes intense and fierce as they drew weapons from under the tables. Not only were there undulating mountain ranges located to the north of northern Jian Nation's border, but there was even a gigantic lake that was widely known as the 400-kilometer lake. A huge island was in the middle of this lake, and an illegal temple not recognized by the imperial court was located on this island. However, this illegal temple was very large in scale, and enjoyed a huge number of visitors and incense. A great demon in the lake had appointed itself water god, and the imperial court of northern Jian Nation was unable to punish it in any practical way. They had no option but to let it be. For the past 200 years, the water god temple and the mountain god temple had viewed each other as archenemies, with many conflicts and skirmishes breaking out between the two parties. However, neither side had the ability to leave their own territory and comprehensively destroy the other. This was a legitimate battle between mountain and water. The victor would definitely shatter their opponent's godly body and annihilate their godly temple. In other words, the loser would be executed and stripped of the ability to even reincarnate following the destruction of their godly body. There were two main battles, one against those insincere friends inside Jin Huang's residence, and one against his archenemy's army in the mountain pass. Both battles exploded into action at almost exactly the same time. With Commandery Governor Jin Huang personally leading the battle inside the main hall, there were some who immediately changed their tune and fell to their knees, kowtowing and begging for forgiveness. There were spots of conflict here and there, yet it was extremely evident that the battle was completely one-sided. Meanwhile, a man wearing a dark green robe and dressed in a suit of golden armor commanded an army of hundreds of spirits and beasts from the lake as he engaged in an earth-shaking battle with the elites from the mountain god's residence in the mountain pass. The skeletal sword practitioner wielding a rusty sword had been a 7th-tier martial artist before passing away, and his soul had gathered together instead of dispersing after his death. Even though his combat power was no longer as great as it had been at his peak, he was still brimming with killing intent as he cut through the enemy army like through butter. The water god stood on a large chariot pulled by sea dragons and winged horses, and he held an iron spear decorated with simple but ancient-looking characters. This was an immortal treasure from the bottom of the lake. He had acted wantonly and pillaged numerous forces throughout the past several hundred years, so his cultivation base was higher than that of the mountain god, even though he had formed his godly body hundreds of years later, and wasn't recognized as an official water god by the imperial court. This time, he had gone as far as to gather an army of mountain spirits and beasts to launch an attack during the mountain god's wedding. He had bribed them with immense wealth, and their overall strength was confidently superior to their opponents. Only then did he dare to leave the large lake and lead his army on shore. He was hellbent on destroying Jin Huang's residence. This was a battle between the great Tao of the mountain god and the water god, so the final outcome would be determined by whose Tao foundation was loftier, and whose planning was more meticulous and far-sighted. Chen Ping'an woke Pei Qian up very early in the morning, and the two of them ate some dry rations for breakfast before quickly setting off again. They purposely detoured around Jin Huang's mountain god residence. With a swift stride, Chen Ping'an lunged onto a tall branch and peered into the distance. There was a solemn expression on his face. That was a wedding banquet for a mountain god, so why was such a bloody battle taking place instead? On the battlefield several kilometers away, the man dressed in golden armor unleashed a mystical ability and caused water to flood the ground. He stood on the back of a gigantic azure fish with an iron spear in his hand. The skeletal sword practitioner had lost an arm. He fought with ferocity and bravery, and secretly joined forces with those qi refiners, but he was still at a disadvantage against this great demon who could summon wind and rain as well as his many subordinates. However, Jin Huang's army enjoyed a geographical advantage, so the casualties on both sides were equally severe. A man wearing a golden robe exited the main hall where the outcome of the battle was already set in stone. He grew explosively as he strode forward, with his height reaching 6 meters, 9 meters, 15 meters, and finally 30 meters by the time he arrived outside the mountain pass. His body was dazzling gold, and he easily strode past the intense battlefield and threw a vicious punch at the azure fish spirit's head. Chen Ping'an retracted his gaze and nimbly jumped to the ground. "Let's go," he said in a solemn voice. "I feel like I'm hearing thunder," Pei Qian said in a hesitant voice. "There's a loud rumble next to my ears." Chen Ping'an pondered for a moment before retrieving a treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman that he had drawn some time ago. He held it between 2 fingers and gently stuck it onto Pei Qian's forehead, shifting it slightly to the right so that it wouldn't cover her vision. "Focus on walking. The talisman won't fall off, but don't try to pull it off either," Chen Ping'an warned. "With the talisman on your forehead, ordinary spirits and ghosts will automatically retreat, even if they see you." However, it was also at this moment that a deafening bellow boomed over from the battlefield. Pei Qian shuddered in fright, and a miserable expression appeared on her face as her legs turned into jelly.
I'm scared.
"My legs aren't listening to me anymore. I can't walk," she said in a quivering voice. She was genuinely afraid of those mountain ghosts and spirits that seemed like they would feast on human flesh. She wasn't putting on a show for Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an felt slightly helpless, so he retrieved a Yang Energy Illumination Talisman and told Pei Qian to hold it in her hands. "Both of these talismans are immortal matters that can definitely protect you." Pei Qian glanced at the swaying treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman in front of her eyes before looking down at the Yang Energy Illumination Talisman in her hand. She sniffed and said in a sobbing voice, "Maybe give me another one, so I can hold one in each hand." Chen Ping'an had no option but to give her another Yang Energy Illumination Talisman. Pei Qian held a talisman in each hand, yet she still swayed from side to side as she took 2 small steps. It was clear that she was deeply terrified, so much so that she could barely summon the strength to walk. "The 2 talismans in your hands are worth many silver coins. Remember to hold them tight. The talisman on your forehead is worth even more, and it's valuable enough to casually buy a huge residence in the capital of Southern Garden Nation. If you're able to walk by yourself and keep up with me, then I can consider giving one of these talismans to you," Chen Ping'an said. The skinny little girl was on the verge of tears, and her small and tanned face was completely scrunched up in a frown as she asked in an aggrieved voice, "For real?" Chen Ping'an nodded in response. Pei Qian took a deep breath and instantly dashed forward. Her arms were outstretched, and it was as if she were carrying water on a pole as she tightly gripped the 2 Yang Energy Illumination Talisman in her hands. There was also the demon-suppressing talisman on her forehead, and this made her appear as comical as could be. After running a short distance, she discovered that Chen Ping'an was no longer beside her, so she immediately turned around and sobbed, "Hurry up and run. If they catch us, they'll definitely eat you, the meteor person, first." Chen Ping'an slapped his forehead before silently running over. Alrighty then, the name Pei Qian wasn't a joke at all. 1. The skinny little girl didn't dare to slack off this time, and she was as swift as the wind as she ran. She didn't grumble about being tired either. Chen Ping'an retrieved deep infatuation and hung it on his hip opposite to the sword-nurturing gourd. He also had a luggage sack slung diagonally across his shoulder and a fishing rod in his hand, yet he matched Pei Qian's pace and remained by her side the entire time. In reality, Chen Ping'an wasn't worried about their safety at all. There wouldn't be any danger as long as they didn't venture into the center of the battlefield. Pei Qian's footsteps were hurried, and her speed would vary greatly as she fled. However, she consumed all of her energy and smarts in order to flee for her life, and she was surprisingly able to run more than 2 kilometers in a single go. One needed to realize just how difficult it was to traverse mountain paths. It was far more difficult than navigating through towns and cities. She didn't stop afterward, and she continued to walk forward without Chen Ping'an needing to urge her on. When she caught her breath, however, she immediately started to sprint forward again. This cycle repeated itself again and again. This caused Qian Pingan, who was secretly observing Pei Qian the entire time, to feel surprised and dazed for a very long time. He had to admit that her martial arts talent was truly impressive. This wasn't the judgment of the young boy Qian Pingan from Jewel's small world. Rather, it was the judgment of fifth-tier martial artist Qian Pingan after he had killed Ding Ying in the Lotus Flower-blessed land. However, cultivation didn't depend solely on aptitude and talent. Take for example Ruan Qiong's attitude toward Qian Pingan. One wouldn't teach a single technique or a single principle if the potential student was someone with a different Tao. Such people couldn't become master and disciple. Even in the martial arts school in the Lotus Flower-blessed land's champion scholar Ali, the old master refused to teach profound fist techniques to his pupils if they didn't possess high enough martial virtue. He would only teach them just enough so that they could make a living. This was the case even though he wasn't a powerful martial artist to begin with. Similarly, Qian Pingan had no intention of teaching Pei Qian even a sliver of his fist techniques. If a person's moral character couldn't keep up with their strength, then what else could they do but bully the weak and commit crimes once they learned powerful fist techniques and cultivated lofty Dao power? Such people would simply decide the life and death of others on a whim. Indeed, Yu Zhini had wanted to kill Qian Pingan after being called a shorty. He was a mighty elite standing at a lofty height, so a single snap of his fingers or a single flick of his sleeves would mean a huge matter of life and death for ordinary mortals outside the mountains. Human strength had its limit, however, and this couldn't be changed regardless of how talented Pei Qian was. She was only a 9-year-old child after all, and she was still very skinny and frail. She was utterly exhausted after running 3 to 4 kilometers, unable to take even a single step forward. She stood on the spot and started to wail in grief and desperation, with tears clouding her vision as she looked at Qian Pingan and his white robes. Her first thought was that Qian Pingan would definitely abandon her and leave her to fend for herself. She was judging him according to her own values. By now, she was unable to speak, but it was clear that she was deeply afraid Qian Pingan would just walk away and abandon her. Qian Pingan squatted down beside her, and Pei Qian immediately wrapped her arms around his neck. Qian Pingan stood up, and Pei Qian's face was filled with tears as she rested on his back. Qian Pingan slowly walked along the small path through the mountain forest, saying in a soft voice, "I won't abandon you as long as you don't misbehave and do bad things." The skinny little girl furiously nodded in understanding. She regained some courage now that she didn't need to run anymore, and also appeared slightly less pale than before as she sobbed, "Okay, I'll become a big goodie starting from today onward." After saying this, Pei Qian pressed her entire face against Qian Pingan's shoulder and furiously dragged it back and forth twice, finally wiping all of the snot and tears from her face. Qian Pingan couldn't help but grimace. Seizing this opportunity when Pei Qian had her guard down, Qian Pingan smiled and asked, "You always think that I should give you money simply because I'm rich. Why is this? What does my wealth have to do with you? Do I have to give you a copper coin simply because I possess a mountain of gold and silver?" Pei Qian didn't need to think before directly replying, "Of course. Why won't you give me anything? Aren't you a good person? Even if you give me dozens of taels of silver, isn't that just a few strands of hair from your head? I know you're a good person, so good people should naturally do good things." Qian Pingan thought for a moment before rewording his question and asking, "If you become very rich one day, and if I become dirt poor at the same time, will you casually give silver to me for no good reason?" Pei Qian fell silent. "You should thank me if I don't smash your head in with a silver ingot. And then I'll take that silver home. It'll all be mine. I won't even bury your corpse." However, she naturally didn't dare to voice these thoughts to Qian Pingan. After thinking for a while, Pei Qian finally came to a realization. It was very unlikely that she would obtain any silver from Qian Pingan. Where had all of his annoying reasonings and principles come from? Had they truly come from the books? She felt like every single character in the books was quite annoying. The two of them fell silent. After silently lying on Qian Pingan's warm back for a long time, Pei Qian finally asked in a quiet voice, "You're a good person, so are all of the good people in the world just like you? Is that how it is?" Qian Pingan didn't reply. The astonishing sound of a humongous being thundering across the earth traveled over from a patch of the mountain forest not far away from where they were. They could hear the sound of trees being snapped and obliterated one after another. The being was directly charging toward Qian Ping'an and Pei Qian, an azure buffalo that had lost one of its horns. It was covered in blood, and its back was riddled with gaping wounds. The beast was an entire head taller than grown men even as it stood on all fours, and it looked at Qian Ping'an and bellowed in human tongue. "Fuck off to the side." Qian Ping'an had already predicted that the buffalo would charge over in this direction. It was also because of this that he stopped in his tracks. Even though the buffalo was radiating with a murderous aura, and was riddled with countless souls of wronged victims from previous battles, Qian Ping'an didn't plan to interfere and block its path. However, the ferocious buffalo with bloodshot eyes surprisingly changed its direction and crashed toward the eyesore standing on the small mountain path. The buffalo was already at its limit, but ordinary mortals would still face certain death if they were to be struck by its charging body. Qian Ping'an reached back and grabbed the treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman from Pei Qian's forehead before tossing it toward that bloodthirsty buffalo. Afterward, he instantly unsheathed his blade. He launched a single slash. The azure buffalo was suppressed and slowed down by the demon-suppressing talisman, and was just about to change its direction and avoid the young boy after realizing that he was no simple pushover. However, the sword strike had already struck its head. There was a tearing sound as the buffalo with bell-sized eyes was directly cleaved into two. Qian Ping'an sheathed his sword and summoned the demon-suppressing talisman back to his hand. The talisman had little spiritual energy remaining, so Qian Ping'an placed it inside his sleeve. He didn't so much as glance at the two halves of the buffalo's corpse as he continued forward with Pei Qian on his back. Commandery Governor Jin Huang rapidly sprinted over from the distance, also riddled with wounds. He hurriedly stopped in his tracks near the water god's corpse. He held the great demon's iron spear in his hand, and couldn't help but gulp with a stunned expression on his face. However, he didn't feel much fear, and instead felt a sincere sense of respect. A solemn expression appeared on his face as he cupped his fists and said, "I bid my respectful farewells, esteemed immortal." Qian Ping'an didn't stop, and he simply turned his head and waved with a smile at that mountain god radiating with a righteous aura. "There's no need to thank me. It didn't take much effort. If you hold a banquet like that in the future, remember not to invite any random person. Even though your intentions are good, unexpected accidents are the most frightening thing on the path of cultivation. In any case, I'll definitely visit your residence and ask for a cup of wine if I pass by again in the future." Fortune and misfortune appeared to exist on two extremes, yet it was often the case that they were only separated by a few simple actions. "I humbly accept your teachings," the mountain god said in slight embarrassment. Qian Ping'an carried Pei Qian for another 5 or so kilometers before putting her down. One tall and one short, the two of them stood there and looked at each other. There was a baffled expression on Pei Qian's face as she started to play dumb again. Qian Ping'an held his hand out. Pei Qian scrunched her small face up and slapped the 2 young energy illumination talismans into Qian Ping'an's hand. "Can't you give me a single one? I ran so far along the mountain path, and I only stopped because I couldn't run anymore." Qian Ping'an slowly walked forward and replied, "Then aim to do even better in the future." The skinny little girl nodded as she silently walked beside him. "You have a heart of stone. A good person. Tui. It's my fault for being blind." Qian Ping'an twisted her ear and scolded, "It's not good to speak ill of others in your mind all the time." Pei Qian stood on her tippy toes and yelped in pain, exclaiming, "I don't dare to do this anymore, honest." Only then did Qian Ping'an let go. However, only a brief moment passed before Qian Ping'an twisted her ear again. The rims of Pei Qian's eyes became red as she promised, "I truly don't dare to do this anymore." After taking another dozen or so steps, Qian Ping'an was just about to reach over and twist her ear again. However, Pei Qian immediately sat down on the ground and started to bawl. Qian Ping'an continued to walk forward by himself. Upon seeing that Qian Ping'an wasn't going to stop, Pei Qian hurriedly stopped crying and jumped to her feet, appearing extremely timid as she walked forward. In order to stop herself from cursing Qian Ping'an in her mind, she had no option but to figure out a method to control her thoughts. In the end, she found that the only useful method was to recite the contents of those books. This was truly a miserable fate. Qian Ping'an paid no more attention to her. They continued to trek through the boundless and gloomy mountain forest. Qian Ping'an became increasingly silent as he recalled that mountain seal. Perhaps this was a false impression, but Chao Qinglang always felt like time was rushing past extremely quickly. In the past, time used to flow slowly like the calm waters of a large river. Now, however, it quickly gurgled forward like the rapid flow of a mountain stream. In fact, it felt as if he could hear the rushing water. In just the blink of an eye, autumn had already passed and winter had already arrived. The first snow of the year started to fall, yet the snowflakes were already as large as goose feathers. Waking up in the morning and gazing out of his window at the vast sheet of white snow, Chao Qinglang was completely stumped and barely able to believe what he was seeing. He put on his clothes and shoes and hurriedly walked out of his room. His first thought was to tell that person that it was snowing heavily. However, Chao Qinglang could only scratch his head as he looked at the door of the wing room. He finally remembered that Chan Ping'an had left a long time ago. However, he always felt as if Chan Ping'an were still sitting there, still sitting on that small stool in the courtyard. He would sit there in the morning and sit there at night. It was as if Chao Qinglang could see him whenever he walked out of his room. Chan Ping'an didn't speak much, but he would always smile when he looked at Chao Qinglang. The little boy hoped that this was auspicious snow heralding a bountiful year. Chao Qinglang raised his hands and breathed some warm air into them. It was quite cold, so he needed to put on an extra layer of clothes. He returned to his room and put on another layer, making sure that his clothes were straight and proper. He sat in front of the small wooden table that his dad had personally made for him, and he flipped open a book and started to loudly recite the sagely essays. Near the end of autumn, a new teacher had arrived at the private school and replaced the previous teacher. He was even stricter and appeared more knowledgeable as well. He explained the principles clearly and unambiguously, and even the least studious pupil in the private school was able to understand his explanations. This was truly very impressive. After completing his session of reading and reciting, Chao Qinglang rubbed his hands together to warm them up. He was a little worried that he was running out of money. Following the passing of his mom and dad, the local government had given him some silver as compensation and aid. However, the local government didn't give him all the silver at once, and they instead had someone bring a portion of the silver over every month at a set time. In the past, he simply needed to ask his parents or other family members if he wanted to eat something or buy something. Now, however, it was necessary for him to carefully budget by himself. He needed to make the most of every single copper coin. This wasn't a good feeling, yet there was nothing he could do about this. He needed to keep living on after all. Fortunately, that person had stayed in his house during the most challenging period. That had allowed Chao Qinglang, the sole surviving member in this residence, to develop some secret thoughts. Chao Qinglang pulled on some deerskin boots that were suited to the snowy weather. Then he started to cry. His mom had bought these boots for him on New Year's Eve. What about this year? Thankfully, Chao Qinglang was able to pull himself together very quickly. He went over to the kitchen and filled his belly before preparing to leave and go to school. However, Chao Qinglang couldn't help but zone out again as he packed his bag with books. Chan Ping'an had promised to make him a small bamboo bookcase when he got time. The books also said that the promise of a noble person was worth its weight in gold. That being the case, it was very likely that Chan Ping'an had genuinely important and urgent matters to attend to. Chao Qinglang didn't know when they could meet again. Chao Qinglang grabbed an oil paper umbrella and his bag and left the courtyard. As he went out, he was astonished to see a familiar face walking past his home. It was surprisingly Mr. Zhong, the teacher from the private school with a rather strange surname. The old teacher was dressed in an azure robe and also holding an oil paper umbrella. He stopped when he saw Chao Qinglang and he asked, "Oh, what a coincidence, do you live here?" Chao Qinglang wanted to put his umbrella down and bow in respect to Mr. Zhong. However, Mr. Zhong shook his hand and said, "It's okay, it's snowing so hard right now." Mr. Zhong possessed profound knowledge, and he was always serious and unsmiling when he taught and answered questions. The students were all quite afraid of him, and Chao Qinglang was no exception. However, he simply held more respect for Mr. Zhong than his fellow classmates. Thus, Chao Qinglang instinctively obeyed Mr. Zhong's instructions when the old teacher said that there was no need to bow and pay respects. The old man and the little boy each held an umbrella in their hand as they walked along the small alley covered in a thick layer of snow. Mr. Zhong had naturally heard of Chao Qinglang's tragic experience. After all, many children in the neighboring streets and alleys were his playmates as well as classmates. They looked at Chao Qinglang differently, and there were also some whispers about his situation. Chao Qinglang simply pretended that he couldn't see or hear anything. With this in mind, Mr. Zhong asked, "Are you facing any difficulties now that you're living by yourself?" "No, I'm not." Chao Qinglang shook his head and replied with a smile. His reply was concise and straightforward, and his temperament and manner of speech seemed nothing like those of a little child from some small alley. It was no wonder that the skinny little girl had teased him and called him a little scholar. Mr. Zhong nodded and said, "You're still very young after all, so don't be afraid to discuss things with me if you genuinely run into problems you cannot solve. You don't need to feel embarrassed. Life is filled with difficulties, and this is the same both in the books and beyond the books. To say nothing of you, even an old man like me has times when I need to ask others for help." "Okay, I understand, Mr. Zhong. I'll look for you if I truly encounter any difficulties," Chao Qinglang replied. He hesitated for a moment before continuing in embarrassment. "Someone else walked me to school before, and he also said something similar to you. He told me that when studying and making a living in the future, it will be inevitable that I need to ask others for help at times. However, I shouldn't resent others and bear a grudge against them if they refuse to help. On the other hand, I must remember their goodwill if they agree to help me." A rare smile appeared on Mr. Zhong's face and he asked, "Was that person called Chen Ping'an?" "Mr. Zhong, you also know him?" Chao Qinglang asked in astonishment. Mr. Zhong nodded and replied, "He's a friend of mine. I didn't imagine that the two of you were acquainted as well." Chao Qinglang instantly became happy. Chen Ping'an was friends with Mr. Zhong. However, Mr. Zhong's expression immediately became stern as he warned the boy, "Don't get the wrong impression that I won't punish you for slacking off in class simply because of this relationship." Chao Qinglang hurriedly nodded in understanding. The old man and the little boy, one a teacher and one a pupil, walked along the street that had already been repaired by the government. They walked slowly, and Chao Qinglang mustered his courage and asked Mr. Zhong how he had become friends with Chen Ping'an. Mr. Zhong replied that they were like-minded people, so they had quickly become genuine friends even though they had only known each other for a very short time. Heavy snow continued to fall, not willing to give them any reprieve. However, Chao Qinglang's heart was filled with warmth and comfort. After arriving at the door of the private school, Chao Qinglang turned around and looked back. Their final time together had also been their final farewell. Chen Ping'an had stopped there and offered that final remark before standing there with his umbrella and watching him walk into the private school. "What's wrong?" Mr. Zhong turned around and asked. Chao Qinglang shook his head, with a dazzling smile spreading across his face as he turned around and briskly walked into the private school. Mr. Zhong sat down at the front of the classroom and waited for all of the children to arrive before beginning his lesson. His sideburns were snow-white, and he was wearing an azure robe. He spoke slowly and explained the sagely principles to the little children. As he expounded these principles, it was as if he possessed a fraction of the righteous aura of Confucian sages as well. There was a large residence belonging to some official in the capital of Southern Garden Nation, and the scripture library located in this residence was extremely renowned throughout the capital. Today a young boy, an illegitimate son, walked into the scripture library as always, finding books to read. However, these books were incredibly precious, so the clan prohibited people from bringing candles into the scripture library, and they also prohibited people from bringing the books outside. Not only that, but many loan copies and rare copies of books were placed in sealed wooden boxes. No one was allowed to open these wooden boxes without permission. The young boy was feeling a slight sense of grief and indignation today. Something was weighing on his mind, so he wasn't actually here to read this time. Instead, he simply wanted to clear his mind in a quiet and peaceful place. The young boy had passed both the county examination and the prefectural examination organized by the capital. He had become a young scholar, yet his results hadn't been anything special. Thus, he had failed to obtain the title of outstanding scholar, and had only gained the right to attend the provincial examination. This caused him to feel extremely ashamed of himself, especially since he had failed his mother. Both of his older brothers had become outstanding scholars in the county examination, and this made the young boy, who was widely regarded as a brilliant talent, to feel extremely puzzled. His older brothers were mediocre when it came to writing essays, and their knowledge was also far inferior to his. Yet, they had somehow achieved much better results than him. In the beginning, the young boy simply pegged this down to him underperforming in the examinations. Meanwhile, his two older brothers had coincidentally overperformed at the same time. Today, however, he inadvertently heard his two inebriated older brothers talking about the intricacies of the county examination and prefectural examination and revealing some dirty secrets. As it turned out, their father had actually bribed the examination officials. The young boy's grandfather was once the head minister in charge of the Ministry of Rights in the capital, so he naturally had many disciples and pupils throughout the entire world. He had presided over the regional examinations many times, so the principal examination officials would all have to refer to him as Zhuoshi or Feng when they saw him. When these were incredibly serious relationships in the officialdom, and they were much akin to the relationships between masters and disciples. The young boy was firmly convinced that his grandfather wouldn't engage in such filthy acts of cheating. In other words, it was definitely the father of his two older brothers who had taken advantage of their grandfather's name to cheat. He had risked their entire clan's culture and reputation to seek personal gain. So be it if this were all. Even though the young boy was an illegitimate son, his upbringing in a wealthy clan of many officials allowed him to gain some understanding of the hidden secrets in the officialdom. However, according to the smug and drunken conversation between his two older brothers, why was his uncle purposely trying to suppress him? Why had his uncle stripped him of the title of outstanding scholar? Standing on the top level of the scripture library, the young boy smiled pitifully as he gazed at the numerous shelves and books. This was a large clan renowned for its scholarly talent in the capital, yet apart from him, an illegitimate son, how many other clan members the same age as him were willing to come here to read and study? There were so many precious books, yet they were simply imprisoned in this tall scripture library year after year, with no one giving them any attention at all. Was this not a huge shame? The young boy raised a hand to wipe the tears from his eyes. What bloody use is studying? Jade trees in the imperial court? What utter bullshit! After grumbling and complaint, the young boy began to search for books to read anyway. He still needed to attend the provincial examination, and needed to read sagely books after all. Even if not for himself, he still needed to study and obtain a scholarly title such that he wouldn't disappoint his mother again. However, he was feeling very irritated today, so he decided that he would find a book that wasn't classified as a classic to read first. As he picked and chose, he eventually wandered to the corner of the scripture library where he grabbed the travel journal of some literatus that was almost brand new. He faltered in the next moment because he noticed something wrong when he opened the cover of the book. He flipped to some certain page, and discovered that a coin was surprisingly hidden inside this book. This coin looked similar to the official copper coins of Southern Garden Nation, yet the characters inscribed on it appeared foreign. Moreover, this coin wasn't made from copper, but rather translucent material that seemed like jade. Pressed between two pages, the coin had naturally left a slight mark on both sides of the books. Perhaps by coincidence, one of the marks highlighted an old saying that every scholar knew, but not every scholar necessarily believed. Books hold houses of gold within. Books hold beautiful women within. Books hold a myriad of grain within. The young boy found this quite strange. After hesitating for a long time, he silently placed the coin inside his sleeve, thinking that he would go home and show his mother. Unexpectedly, however, this seemingly innocuous incident almost caused a huge calamity. While studying in the clan school one time, he took out the coin and played with it. One of his older brothers happened to see this, and surprisingly accused the young boy of stealing this coin from his study desk. This caused a huge commotion, and even attracted the attention of their grandfather, who always ignored such worldly matters. Afterward, their grandfather, the previous head minister of the Ministry of Rights who now studied Daosim in earnest, confiscated the contentious coin. Not only that, but he even summoned all of the trusted stewards and attendants in the clan to spend 2 entire days poring through the tens of thousands of books in the scripture library. However, this was to no avail. They didn't find a second coin. After ordering everyone to leave the scripture library, the previous head minister prohibited anyone from revealing this matter to outsiders. Those who flouted this rule would be expelled from the clan. The old man stayed in the scripture library and mulled over this by himself for a long time. Afterward he found his terrified grandson and brought him back to the scripture library, giving him both the coin and the travel journal that the coin had been hidden inside. He smiled faintly and said, "If two such coins existed, then you would have lost this immortal fated opportunity. Rest assured and take them. They rightfully belong to you. Remember to study earnestly in the future. All of the books in the scripture library are open to you now, and you can read any book that you want. You're allowed to bring them out of the scripture library to read as well." Having his misfortune transformed into fortune, the young boy was incredibly confused as he accepted the book. The previous head minister revealed another secret, saying in a meaningful and heartfelt manner, "In the previous dynasty, neither of the two young prodigies who became champion scholars enjoyed a good reputation. One of them further lost their moral integrity in their twilight years. Because of this, the current dynasty is deeply wary of youthful champion scholars. You failed to become an outstanding scholar not because of your uncle's actions. He's not sinister enough to do this, nor does he have the courage. I'm still alive after all. In reality, it was my intention to suppress you and temper your character. That way, you can accumulate enough knowledge to slowly utilize in the imperial court in the future. At the end of the day, serving in the imperial court isn't the same as playing a game of Go. Making a brilliant first move won't necessarily lead to a good outcome in this dynasty." After the young boy left in emotion and high spirits, the old man turned around and retrieved another book that also had a mark on two adjacent pages. However, there was no coin in sight. The mark on one page also highlighted another sagely principle. "O noble and elegant person, take a knife and file to sharpen your knowledge, take a chisel and sand to polish your character." 3. There only existed a single coin, so this formlessly indicated that the young boy was receiving all of the fortune by himself. This was the intangible and undetectable will of the heavens. In fact, even the previous head minister who yearned to learn immortal techniques didn't dare to snatch this fated opportunity from his grandson. The old man, who had spent more than half his life in the imperial court, sighed with emotion and remarked with a hint of sincere respect and admiration, "Transcendent beings from beyond the mortal world, such is the profound nature of their divine actions." Qian Pingan made himself a large bamboo case as he and Pei Qian continued to trek through the mountains. Theoretically speaking, this bamboo case could fit the luggage sack and many other things. However, Qian Pingan still insisted on Pei Qian carrying the luggage sack and holding the bamboo fishing rod. In addition to this, he also crafted her a small and handy hiking pole. The mountains undulated far into the distance, and the long rivers stretched beyond the horizons. Compared to their hasty travels in the beginning, when Qian Pingan had seemingly wanted to leave Parasol Leaf Continent and return to Eastern Treasured Vial Continent as soon as possible, they were now slowing down and returning to a steady pace. However, this still exhausted Pei Qian, who continued to grumble day after day. Compared to the time when they had just met, however, Pei Qian no longer complained in such a direct and offensive manner. Perhaps it was due to reading some books, or it was born from the fear of being abandoned by an angry Qian Pingan. Pei Qian had now learned to speak in a roundabout manner when she complained. Qian Pingan turned a deaf ear to her complaints, and this caused Pei Qian to sulk even more. Afterward, the two of them witnessed many sceneries that allowed Pei Qian to significantly broaden her horizons. For example, they came across countless fireflies one autumn night, and it was as if the sky was dotted with innumerable small lanterns. While Qian Pingan wasn't watching, Pei Qian used her hiking pole to attack them with ferocity, filling the air with cracking sounds and covering the earth with broken corpses. She immediately stopped when Qian Pingan looked back, acting as if she hadn't done anything at all. She lowered her head and pretended that she was just earnestly walking forward. They also walked through an incredibly strange forest. The soil was fertile and the branches were spread out, and there were surprisingly the shriveled corpses of countless birds and beasts hanging on these branches. Pei Qian was so terrified that she had only dared to walk while holding onto Qian Pingan's sleeve. Before entering the forest, Qian Pingan retrieved a Yang Energy Illumination Talisman and tossed it into the forest. The talisman, made from ordinary talisman paper, immediately caught on fire, but it burned very slowly. Seeing this, Qian Pingan directly entered the forest. Pei Qian begged Qian Pingan to give her a talisman to protect herself, yet Qian Pingan completely ignored her request. He said that if she was afraid, then she could loudly recite the sagely principles from that book. Doing this could also ward off evil. In reality, that Confucian book was quite thin. Pei Qian had learned all of the characters in the book already, and had also finished reading the book. She had asked for a new book so that she wouldn't need to reread the same book again and again. Doing so was incredibly boring after all. However, Qian Ping'an had stubbornly refused her request. Not only did he force her to read the book again and again, but he even forced her to read it out loud. She would start reading in the morning when Qian Ping'an started to practice standing meditation, and she would still be reading in the evening when Qian Ping'an was also still practicing standing meditation. In the end, she was genuinely able to memorize the entire book. The dense forest remained calm all the way until they walked out from the other end. Pei Qian's forehead was dripping with sweat, and her voice was hoarse. This was, of course, from the exertion of loudly reciting the Confucian book for so long. Only after Qian Ping'an and Pei Qian had walked more than 5 kilometers into the distance did the towering trees in the dense forest started to violently thrash about as if venting their fury. Afterward, the two of them had also passed a valley where colorful butterflies fluttered beside a large pool under a waterfall. That was a spectacular and dazzling sight. While Qian Ping'an was cooking, Pei Qian swiftly killed a dozen or so butterflies and picked the most beautiful one to place inside her book. In the end, Qian Ping'an punished Pei Qian with a solid knuckle to her forehead, so forceful that she squatted down and wailed in agony. Her forehead was swollen, and she sulked the entire time while eating. One time, the two of them also came across a woodsman chopping wood in the mountains. The woodsman invited them to his home for a meal, and Qian Ping'an initially wanted to give him some money for the food. However, the honest and simple woodsman and his family refused to accept any money no matter what. In the end, Qian Ping'an was left with no option but to relent. Before leaving the woodsman's home, Qian Ping'an told Pei Qian to thank the woodsman for the meal. The skinny little girl had eaten quite a lot, yet she was still unwilling to express any gratitude. However, when she noticed the look in Qian Ping'an's eyes, she immediately bowed in respect and thanked the woodsman for the meal. After leaving the undulating mountain ranges, the two of them came across a large river where Pei Qian witnessed ship haulers dragging a large ship along for the first time. The men shouted slogans as they marched forward under the scorching sun, and the sight caused Pei Qian's eyes to widen in shock. Afterward, she secretly chuckled in delight, thinking that there were truly quite a lot of miserable people in the world. However, she quickly wiped the smile from her face, afraid that she would be punished again if Qian Ping'an saw her reaction. She only collected slightly less firewood than last time, yet Qian Ping'an still punished her by only allowing her to eat a single small bowl of rice. This Qian Ping'an was truly difficult to please. Sure enough, rich people all deserved a good beating. When she used her hiking pole to secretly master a peerless sword technique, she would definitely beat Qian Ping'an up until he cried for his mommy and daddy. Could he still glare at her at that time? As they continued to travel, they had to adapt to the conditions and eat whatever was available. Pei Qian suddenly wanted to fish while walking along the banks of the river, and she asked Qian Ping'an to help her make a fishing rod. However, Qian Ping'an ignored her request. As a result, Pei Qian was forced to grab a hatchet and chop some strong and thick bamboo for herself. After finally chopping it down, however, Pei Qian had realized that this kind of bamboo wasn't suitable for making fishing rods at all. Instead, it was probably more suited to making poles used to steer boats. In the end, she picked a thinner stalk of bamboo with a sullen expression on her face. Fortunately, the miserly Qian Ping'an didn't take things too far, and he still agreed to give her a fishing line and a fishing hook. The two of them then sat down and fished not too far away from each other. Qian Ping'an caught fish after fish, and he even caught a large carp that was the length of Pei Qian's arm. Meanwhile, Pei Qian failed to catch even a single fish. In fact, not even a small prawn took her bait. Perhaps the fish in the river also discriminated against people? Perhaps they were also looking down on her? Pei Qian was so angry that she wanted to dive into the river to smash all of the fish and crustaceans to death with her bamboo fishing rod. However, Pei Qian still beamed with joy when eating the big pot of fish soup that night, and she nervously asked Qian Ping'an for a third bowl of rice. She claimed that she had exerted all of her energy while fishing during the day, so she needed to eat more rice to replenish her energy. She also said that she would drink less fish soup and not fight Qian Ping'an for it. Pei Qian initially thought that Qian Ping'an would refuse her request, yet he surprisingly nodded and granted her a third bowl of rice, allowing her to eat to her heart's content. Pouring fish soup onto rice. There wasn't a more fragrant delicacy in the world. At the very least, this was the case for Pei Qian, whose belly now couldn't be fuller. Afterward, she fished with Qian Ping'an again on some other day, and she still cast her line and swung her fishing rod in a random manner. Just like the first time, she failed to get a single bite on her bait. As for Qian Ping'an, he caught a huge azure fish after a difficult struggle that lasted at least 15 minutes. Pei Qian rolled her eyes while watching him run back and forth along the riverbank. He was a cultivator skilled in both sword techniques and immortal techniques, so did he not feel embarrassed being toyed around by some stupid fish? Looking at her incredibly steady fishing rod, Pei Qian complained about the fish in the water not giving her any face at all. She sighed and blamed the heavens for not giving her the opportunity to display her impressive skills. In the end, she planned to never fish again in her life. She was given no reward after showing so much patience and putting in so much effort, so what was the point of trying again and again? While having lunch that day, Qian Ping'an surprisingly talked to her about some fishing skills and techniques. Pei Qian understood everything, yet she was still unwilling to learn from Qian Ping'an. Only when Qian Ping'an said that he would personally teach her next time had Pei Qian relented, and not thrown her fishing rod away. She had then asked in a hesitant voice, "Fish soup does taste good, but I'm getting a little bored of it after eating it every single meal. Why don't we eat something else?" Hearing this, Qian Ping'an had replied, "Sure thing. Then go and find something else." Pei Qian had played dumb and said, "I'm still too young, so I have the heart but not the strength." The next day, Qian Ping'an didn't use his fishing rod, and he used Pei Qian's fishing rod instead. After waiting for a long time, he ignored all of the small fish and only raised the fishing rod with vigor when a large fish weighing 3 to 4 kilograms bit down on the bait. The fishing rod immediately bent into a beautiful arc. Pei Qian, who had been yawning the entire time, immediately gaped in excitement. Qian Ping'an told her to make haste and grab the fishing rod so that she could reel in this big fish. Pei Qian immediately jumped up and grabbed the fishing rod. However, Qian Ping'an could barely bring himself to look at the following scene. Pei Qian tightly gripped the fishing rod with both hands, hugging it tightly as she gritted her teeth and yanked back with all her might. It was clear that she hadn't taken any heed of Qian Ping'an's lessons yesterday: how to slowly lead the fish around, how to wind and unwind the fishing line, how to wait patiently and weaken the fish, how to make the fish choke on water a few times, and so on. She had tossed all of this out of her mind, and she was now trying to drag the fish to shore with her brute strength. This should have been a calm and relaxing fishing experience, yet Pei Qian somehow managed to transform it into a battle between human and river. The azure fish wasn't small, it was strong, and it was still swimming in the river. On the other side of the struggle, Pei Qian was still inexperienced and lacking in strength. In a moment of carelessness, the skinny little girl stumbled forward and was surprisingly dragged into the river along with her fishing rod. Pei Qian had once laughed about Qian Ping'an spewing nonsense and saying that fish would choke on water. How was this possible? Now, however, it was her turn to choke on water. Pei Qian didn't know how to swim, yet she became extremely stubborn at this moment and unexpectedly refused to let go of her fishing rod. In the end, it was Qian Ping'an who dragged her from the river and brought her back to the bank. Meanwhile, Pei Qian's fishing rod had been dragged away by the big azure fish. Pei Qian didn't wail in a heart-wrenching manner this time. She just stood on the riverbank and sobbed in silence. The fish had escaped, so there was naturally no fish soup to drink tonight. Her fishing rod had also been snatched away. Even though Pei Qian knew that there were dry rations to eat, enough to keep her from starving, and there would be rice as well, she still couldn't stop herself from feeling an inexplicable sense of grief. Qian Ping'an helped her wipe the tears and river water from her face. However, he didn't say anything to console her. He was reminded of those times in his own childhood, the times before he had met Lu Xianying, who was skilled at fishing. He hadn't understood the intricacies of fishing, and he had known nothing about picking the right time and choosing the right location. Thus, he had often returned home empty-handed. When the blazing sun hung high in the sky, he would often sit there until his skin burned with pain. Perhaps this was similar to what Pei Qian was feeling right now. They naturally had nothing but rice and pickled vegetables for their next meal. Pei Qian changed into dry clothes in her small tent, but she was in very low spirits as she ate. Qian Pingan smiled and asked, "Why did you suddenly become so brave? Were you not afraid of drowning to death?" Squatting beside him with her head lowered as she ate rice, Pei Qian's voice was muffled as she replied, "You were standing right there and watching over me, no?" Qian Pingan rewarded her with a knuckle to the forehead. Pei Qian immediately looked up and fumed. "Why did you hit me? I'm almost about to die from sadness over here." "Eat your rice," Qian Pingan chuckled. Pei Qian humphed coldly and turned around to look at the river. The fishing rod which she had personally made with much difficulty was gone for good. This caused her to feel a little sad. "You can have my fishing rod," Qian Pingan said. Pei Qian felt slightly puzzled. However, it didn't look like Qian Pingan was joking, so she cracked a grin and said, "Then I'll kindly allow you to borrow my fishing rod all the time in the future. I'm a very generous person after all." Qian Pingan couldn't help but chuckle in anger. Why wasn't Pei Qian willing to use her smarts on reading books and learning characters? Only when Pei Qian was fast asleep in the depths of the night would Qian Pingan silently practice the 6-step walking meditation and the techniques from the proper sword scripture while keeping watch. They arrived at a small town where they replenished some necessities. Qian Pingan also bought Pei Qian some new clothes, causing her to become absolutely ecstatic. They stayed in a small inn at night, and Pei Qian happily rolled around in her bed. It had been a very long time since she had last slept in a bed. However, she suddenly noticed a white cat lying on the windowsill and staring at her. Pei Qian jumped off her bed and shouted, "Are you looking for trouble? You actually dare to glare at me." She then grabbed her hiking pole that was resting against the table and jabbed it at the white cat. For once she was actually right. The white cat really was here to start trouble. Not only was it not scared away by her attacks, but it even jumped around nimbly on the windowsill, dodging everything easily. It occasionally bared its teeth and hissed at Pei Qian as well. Pei Qian panted heavily, leaning on her hiking pole and widening her eyes in anger as she roared, "From where have you come, vile demon? I can spare your life if you hurry up and reveal your name." Pei Qian was naturally doing this for fun. However, the white cat surprisingly shot a glance at her before saying in human tongue, "What a crazy little girl. Is there something wrong with your brain?" The white cat turned around and leaped out of her room, disappearing without a trace. Pei Qian was absolutely terrified, and immediately tossed her hiking pole away and ran next door to furiously knock on the door. Qian Pingan opened the door, and Pei Qian immediately exclaimed in a quivering voice, "There was a cat that could speak human tongue." "I know," Qian Pingan replied with a nod. Looking at the completely unsurprised Qian Pingan, Pei Qian couldn't help but ask in a dazed voice, "We're not in the mountains anymore, yet spirits and demons still exist here?" Qian Pingan returned to his seat beside the table, and picked up the immortal book that he had purchased from Stalactite Mountain. Many spirits, ghosts, and supernatural entities exist in the towns and cities. This isn't strange at all. Most of these beings won't disturb ordinary mortals, and some wealthy families might even raise some interesting spirits. For example, some noblewomen will raise all kinds of miniature spirits in their makeup kits. Some spirits will have wings, allowing them to fly around and apply makeup for their owner, as if they're normal maidservants. Pei Qian sullenly sat down on the opposite side of the table, resting her arms and head on its surface as she asked, "Won't this scare them to death? I was almost scared to death just then." Qian Pingan smiled and replied, "All kinds of strange and peculiar matters exist in the myriad worlds. You'll grow accustomed to this once you travel through more mountains and rivers." "Is that so?" Pei Qian sighed with emotion. That old man brewing tea on the mountain peak and that woman washing her hair by the stream were both spirits from the mountains, Qian Pingan revealed casually. However, neither of them desired to harm mortals, and they just yearned for a normal human life. "Didn't you get along very well with both of them?" Pei Qian widened her eyes and gaped in shock. To say nothing of the old man's kindly and amiable nature, that beautiful big sister had even used a leaf to play a tune for her after washing and combing her hair. Pei Qian's brow furrowed and her face scrunched up in fear. Only the two of them weren't human. "Everyone else that we encountered were humans just like you and me," Qian Pingan chuckled. During their trip, they had also come across local officials supervising commoners as they paved roads and built bridges, descendants of wealthy families and renowned literati traveling around and sightseeing, and high-ranking courtesans dressed in expensive clothes and ornaments. The latter had caused Pei Qian's eyes to light up in envy. After all, it was as if these women were wearing money. They had also come across some travelers from the cultivation world, who had sat high atop their mighty horses and peered down at them with haughty expressions while asking for directions. This had infuriated Pei Qian greatly. "What about that little guy?" Pei Qian suddenly asked. She was referring to the little lotus spirit. "It's not willing to see you," Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. Pei Qian stood up and went to her room to grab that book from her luggage sack. She then returned to Chen Ping'an's room where she sat down and also started to read. She didn't dare to return to her room as she was afraid that the white cat would return to exact revenge. Her sword skills were still a bit lacking right now, so she wasn't confident that she could subdue demons and eliminate fiends.